They called her the weakest Luna their kingdom had ever seen. They laughed when she stumbled through ceremonies. They whispered when her mate looked through her like she was glass. And when the vote came, the vote to strip her title, chain her wrists, and drag her to the northern border, not one voice rose in her defense. Not one. They threw Lyra Vale into the frozen north and told themselves the cold would do what they lacked the spine to do themselves. But here's what they forgot. Ice doesn't kill everyone it touches. Sometimes, it builds them into something the world has never seen. Stay with me tonight. Drop your city in the comments. This story belongs to all of us. The morning they exiled Lyra Vale, the sky above Ashen Vale was the color of a bruise. She noticed that. She noticed everything in those final hours. The way a person notices every detail of a room they know they'll never see again. The grain in the wooden floor of the Alpha's hall, the particular smell of pine smoke and wet stone, the sound of boots on packed earth as the pack's enforcers formed two lines on either side of her. Her hands were bound in front of her with rough-spun rope, not chains. That was the insult wrapped inside the mercy. Chains were for enemies worth fearing. Lyra was not worth fearing. That was what they'd decided. She walked between those lines with her spine straight and her chin level, and she felt every single eye on her. 30, 40, 60 pack members crowding the doorways and the yard, pressing forward to watch. Some of them looked away when she met their gaze. Most didn't bother. Darren Vale stood at the end of the path. Her mate, the Alpha of Ashen Vale. 6 feet 3 inches of muscle and command, jaw set, arms crossed over his chest, wearing the black coat she'd once brushed clean with her own hands. He wasn't watching her the way a man watches something he's about to lose. He was watching her the way a man watches something he's already decided is gone. Eyes flat, mouth pressed into a line that communicated nothing except the faint impatience of someone waiting for an unpleasant task to be finished. Lyra stopped walking. The enforcer at her left shoulder put a hand on her arm. She let him. She was looking at Darren. "You don't have to watch," she said. Her voice came out steady. She hadn't expected that. Her chest felt like something had been scooped out of it, raw-edged and hollow, but her voice was steady. Darren's jaw shifted. "This isn't personal, Lyra." "I know," she said. "That's the worst part." For half a second, she thought she saw something move across his face. A flicker. Something that could have been discomfort or grief or even shame. Then it was gone, and he was looking past her, nodding at the enforcers, and her feet were moving again because the hand on her arm was moving her. She turned her face away from him before he could see what his expression did to her. She would not give Ashenvale that. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her break in their yard. The northern gate was iron and old timber, and it groaned when they shoved it open. Beyond it, the road ran 300 yards through patchy woodland before it reached the snow line, and beyond the snow line, the frozen north began. Nobody had mapped what lay past the first 100 miles of the frozen north. Nobody had come back to do the mapping. Mira was there, at the gate. Lyra saw her through the crowd, her packmate, the closest thing she'd had to a friend in Ashenvale's hierarchy. A woman with quick, dark eyes and clever hands who taught Lyra half of what she knew about herb medicine and the other half about which conversations to pretend she hadn't heard. Mira was not moving forward to say goodbye. She was standing in the middle of the crowd with her arms folded tight across her stomach and her eyes fixed on a point somewhere above Lyra's shoulder, and her expression was the carefully emptied face of a woman who had already calculated the cost of public association and found it too high. Lyra looked at her long enough that Mira had to notice. Then she looked away. That was its own kind of goodbye. The rope around her wrists was cut at the gate. Standard exile protocol. Bound within pack territory. Released at the border. The enforcer who cut it was a young man she didn't know well, one of the newer bloods, and he wouldn't meet her eyes. His hands were shaking slightly. She wondered if that was guilt or just cold. "Your pack rejects your claim," the head enforcer said, reading from the formal exile declaration in a voice that suggested he'd done this before and hated it each time. "Lyra Vale, formerly Luna of Ashenvale, you are cast from this pack's protection, stripped of rank and title, and exiled beyond the northern boundary. You have no claim on pack lands, pack resources, or pack blood from this hour forward. You are— I know what I am, Lyra said. The silence that followed was the kind that pressed against eardrums. She stepped through the gate. The iron swung shut behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. For a long moment she stood on the other side of it and didn't move. The cold was immediate and specific. Not the frozen north cold yet, just the ordinary bite of an Ashenvale morning, but it felt different on the wrong side of that gate. It felt like the air itself had been informed of her status change. She heard the crowd behind the gate dispersing, voices, footsteps, then the ordinary sounds of a pack morning resuming. Because that was what happened, she realized. That was the thing nobody told you about exile. Life on the other side of the gate simply continued. The world did not pause. The pack did not pause. Her absence would be a blank space for approximately 3 days, and then it would be wallpapered over with new dynamics and new gossip. And within a month, Lyra Vale would be something people referenced in cautionary terms. She could hear her own breathing. She started walking north. She'd been given nothing. That was technically in violation of the exile protocols. The formal code stipulated that exiled pack members received 3 days of food, a water bladder, and a cold weather wrap before crossing the border. Darren had signed a document stating those provisions had been provided. The document was, as far as Lyra could determine, a lie. She had the clothes on her back. Pack standard winter gear, which was better than nothing. Heavy wool trousers, a lined coat, boots that had seen 2 winters already and were starting to separate at the left heel. She had no food. She had no water bladder. She had a small knife in her coat pocket that she'd palmed from the kitchen 3 days ago when the verdict was first handed down, because she was not an idiot and she'd known, somewhere beneath the shock and the grief, that the provisions order would be worth exactly the paper it was signed on. The snow line came up faster than she'd expected. 1 mile out from Ashenvale's border, the path became a path, and then a trail, and then a suggestion, and then nothing. Just white ground and the dark teeth of pines ahead of her, and the sky pressing down the color of old pewter. She walked. She had no destination. That was the honest truth of it, and she let herself sit with that honesty for the first few miles because she'd learned, from her mother, from hard experience, from the slow grind of 6 years as a Luna in a pack that had never fully accepted her, that refusing to look at a true thing didn't make it any less true. It just meant you ran into it face first in the dark. She had no destination and no provisions and no pack and no mate bond. That last one was the ugliest truth, the one with the most edges. A severed mate bond felt, she was discovering, like something had been pulled out of her chest with both hands. Not cut, pulled. The wound was ragged, and the bleeding was internal, and there was no visible blood, which meant nobody could see how badly she was hurt, which meant she had to carry it perfectly upright. She carried it perfectly upright. The first night she found a hollow beneath a deadfall pine large enough to crawl into, and she pulled pine boughs in behind her for warmth and insulation, and she lay in the dark with her knife in her hand and her eyes open, listening to the sounds of the north. The north was louder than she'd expected. Wind through the upper branches made a sound like breathing, or like something very large moving at a distance. Small things moved in the underbrush. She couldn't see them, but she could hear them, could track their movement by the tiny disturbances in the snowpack. Somewhere further out, something howled, and it was not the howl of any wolf she recognized. The pitch was wrong. The duration was wrong. She did not howl back. She was no longer pack. She had no right to the language of it. She lay in the cold and felt the hollow place in her chest pulse steadily, like a second heartbeat made entirely of grief, and she thought, not for the first time, about Darren's face at the gate, the flat eyes, the minute impatience of a man waiting for inconvenience to be resolved. This isn't personal, Lyra. She turned that sentence over in her mind the way you turn a stone to find what's living under it. What was the alternative to personal? Business? Had 6 years of her life, her work, her nights, her hands in his hair, her body against his body, her grief at 3 miscarriages that he'd never once held her through. Had all of that been business? Had she simply been an arrangement that had outlived its usefulness? She thought she'd hated him in the moment, standing in that yard, watching his flat eyes. She thought that was the bottom of what she felt. She discovered, in the dark under the deadfall pine, with the north wind pressing at the branches and something howling in the black distance, that what she'd felt in the yard was not hate. Hate was what replaced the grief when you finally let the grief burn all the way through. She wasn't there yet. She allowed herself 1 hour. She had no timepiece, but she'd always had a good internal clock, and she lay in the dark, and she let herself feel all of it. The hollow chest, the ragged wound, the memory of Mira's deliberately averted eyes, the sound of that iron gate, the faces in the crowd, the particular cruelty of 30 people watching you walk to your death without a single voice raised in argument. She felt all of it with her eyes open and her knife in her hand and her jaw set. Then she shut it down. She did not shut it down because she was strong, or because she'd conquered the grief, or because she'd found some resource of inner fortitude that transcended ordinary human pain. She shut it down because there was no version of surviving the frozen north that included spending energy on a man who'd watched her go with flat eyes. Energy was the one resource she could not afford to waste. She slept in 2-hour increments. She didn't freeze. That surprised her a little. Shed. The second day was harder than the first. Hunger was manageable. She'd gone hungry before, during lean seasons in Ashenvale, when her status in the pack hierarchy meant she was last in the distribution order, another thing that had never quite been official policy, never articulated, simply practiced with the smooth consistency of an unspoken rule. She knew how to compact herself around hunger, how to slow her breathing and her movements and let her body draw on its reserves without panicking. The cold was different. The cold was not simply an absence of warmth. It was a presence, an active and specific force that found every unsealed edge of her clothing and pressed through. The gap at her collar, the separating heel of her left boot, the places where the cuffs of her coat didn't quite meet the cuffs of her inner layer. It found those gaps and worked at them with a patience that felt almost deliberate. She kept moving. Movement was the obvious answer. The trees were thinning. She'd expected that. The frozen north's tree line was documented in Ashenvale's records, part of the same records that documented survival rates in the region. The tree line was at approximately 40 miles from Ashenvale's border. After the tree line, the terrain opened into the high tundra shelf that nobody had successfully crossed. On the second day, she found a stream that hadn't frozen yet, its center still moving with the dark insistence of water that doesn't know how to stop. She drank from it with both hands, ignoring the way the cold hit the back of her throat like a fist, and she followed it upstream for 2 hours because upstream almost always led to either high ground or shelter, and she needed one or the other. She found both. The high ground was a ridge of dark rock jutting up through the snowpack, south-facing enough that one side of it was partially clear. And at the base of that cleared face, screened by a stand of scrub spruce that shouldn't have been surviving at this altitude, there was a structure. She stopped. The structure was old. Older than the oldest building in Ashenvale, she'd guess. The stone was the rough-cut type that predated any masonry technique she recognized, fitted without mortar in the dry stack method, and the roof was sawed, half collapsed, but the walls were still standing. 3 walls, anyway. The fourth had partially given way, which was why she could see inside from 50 yards out, see the dark hollow of the interior, the remains of a fire ring in the center. Abandoned shelter. Empty. She stood in the tree line and watched it for a long time before she approached, not because she was afraid of the structural integrity. She was afraid because abandoned shelter in the frozen north raised questions about why it had been abandoned, and those questions had answers she might not want to know. Nothing moved in or around the structure. After 20 minutes, she crossed to it. The fire ring was old cold ash, the kind that had been sitting for years, maybe decades. The floor was packed earth covered in a layer of frost. Whoever had built this had laid in a supply of dry wood against the interior wall that still retained one of the original occupants' most important and overlooked contributions. It wasn't just wood, it was wood stacked correctly, bark side out, under a lean of flat stone that had kept the worst of the moisture off it for however long it had been sitting there. The wood might actually be burnable. She gathered the driest pieces and built a fire with the methodical care of someone who understood that failure was not an option. She had 3 fire-starting materials: the flint edge of her knife blade, her belt buckle, and the inner lining of her coat pocket, which she'd identified 2 days ago as being the right kind of dry fiber. She didn't let herself rush. She breathed slowly and struck precisely and caught a spark on the 4th attempt, and she nursed that spark with the focus of someone diffusing a mechanism because that was what it was. That was exactly what it was. The fire caught. The warmth hit her in a wave that felt almost violent in its suddenness. She hadn't realized how thoroughly cold had settled into her until the alternative arrived, and her body recognized it with an intensity that was almost grief in reverse. She sat down hard on the ground next to the fire, and for a moment she couldn't do anything except exist in the warmth and let her hands shake. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't noticed until now. "All right," she said aloud. Her voice sounded strange in the hollow of the structure, raw, used. "All right," she said again. Not to anyone, just to the air, just to establish that there was still a here in the space, that the cold and the distance and the 2 days of this hadn't dissolved whatever Lyra Vale actually was into something unrecognizable. She checked her hands. The fingertips were white with the early stages of cold injury, but not past recovery. She held them close to the fire and watched color return and cataloged what she had and what she needed. What she had: one knife, one fire and one stone structure with 3 walls, dry wood for approximately 2 more days, her clothing, her knowledge of herb medicine, northern flora, basic survival techniques absorbed from 8 years of lunar responsibilities that had included, in Ashenvale's tradition, the physical preparation of the pack's healers. What she needed: food. Water not from an open stream in sub-zero temperatures. A way to repair her boot before the separation got worse. Intelligence about what lay beyond this ridge. What she had that she hadn't yet listed. 6 years of being underestimated. She thought about that while her hands stopped shaking. Being underestimated was not, she'd decided somewhere around the end of her 4th year in Ashenvale, inherently a disadvantage. It was uncomfortable. It was exhausting in a specific way that was different from the exhaustion of physical hardship. It was the exhaustion of being constantly assessed and found insufficient, of having your contributions minimized and your failures amplified, of navigating a hierarchy that had decided your ceiling before you'd ever walked through the door. All of that was genuinely terrible. But it also meant that nobody had ever tried to properly predict her. Darren hadn't predicted that she'd walk through that gate with her spine straight. Mira hadn't predicted, or had predicted and chosen to ignore, the calculation behind Lyra's apparently passive acceptance of her fate. The pack hadn't predicted that she'd palm a knife. Nobody in Ashenvale had ever seriously modeled what Lyra Vale would do if her back was against a wall, because in their working model, Lyra Vale didn't have the resources to do anything. She was the weak Luna, the placeholder, the mismatched mate who'd never quite taken hold. She fed another piece of wood to the fire and let herself think, for the first time without grief clouding the machinery, about what had actually happened. Hulk. The accusation had been brought by Elder Goran. That was 3 weeks ago, though it felt like 3 years. She'd been in the healing house working through the winter medicines inventory when the summons had come. Not a request, a summons, delivered by 2 enforcers with the particular expressionlessness of men carrying out orders they hadn't been invited to question. The accusation that she had communicated with the Lowfall Pack, Ashenvale's oldest enemy, and provided them with information about Ashenvale's border patrol schedules. She'd stood in the center of the Alpha's hall with 50 pack members watching, and she'd said, very clearly, "That accusation is false." Goran had smiled. Goran had a specific smile, the kind that contained a conclusion that had been reached well before the evidence was presented. "We have a witness, Luna." "Who?" "Someone whose testimony I trust." "That's not how this works, Elder. You know that's not how this works. You give me the name, you give me the testimony, I respond to it." Darren, at the head of the room, had said nothing. That had been the moment. Not the verdict, not the gate, but that moment Darren's silence while Goran introduced an unnamed witness and an unverified accusation and an assembled pack that had already decided. She'd looked at Darren across that room, and she'd tried to find something in his face. He'd looked back with those flat eyes and said nothing, and she'd understood, not gradually, not through a process of reluctant accumulation, but all at once, like a crack running through ice, that he had known. He had known what was coming, and he had not only failed to stop it, he had permitted it. The witness was produced eventually, a young woman from the mid-tier of the pack, nervous and over-rehearsed in the specific way of someone who's been told exactly what to say and is trying not to forget any of it. She testified that she'd seen Lyra passing notes to a low-fall messenger at the Eastern Market 2 months prior. Lyra had not been at the Eastern Market 2 months prior. She'd been in the healing house for 5 consecutive days during a fever outbreak, which was documented in the records she herself maintained. She said this. Goran acknowledged it, moved on as if it were a minor point. Darren said nothing. The verdict took 4 hours. Guilty. Exile. She'd requested a second hearing. She'd been told that was not available under the circumstances. She'd requested access to the witness for direct questioning. She'd been told that was not appropriate at this stage. She'd requested that Darren exercise his alpha authority to suspend the exile order pending a proper investigation, which was his absolute right under PAC law. Darren had looked at her with those flat eyes and said, "The PAC's decision has been rendered." She sat beside the fire in the ruined stone structure at the edge of the frozen north, and she thought about that conversation, and the grief was still there. It would probably always be there, somewhere, the specific grief of a woman who had loved something that turned out to be a mirage. But beneath the grief, something else was burning with a heat that was cleaner and more specific. The accusation was planted. She'd known that from the first second, the way you know a lie, not because you can disprove it in the moment, but because you know your own life, and the lie doesn't fit inside it. Planted by whom? For what purpose? With what endgame? Those were questions she didn't have enough information to answer from inside an Ashenvale courtroom, with Darren's silence pressing on her from the high seat. She needed to survive first. Then she could answer questions. She found food on the 3rd day. The north face of the ridge had a series of rock exposures where the snowmelt ran off before it could fully freeze, and in one of those exposures she found winter root, the thick-stemmed tuber that didn't die in the cold, that in fact sent up new runners in the freeze as a survival adaptation, that tasted like clay and old wood and kept you alive. She dug it up with her knife and ate it raw, standing in the snow, not because she was too hungry to wait, but because cooking it required time and she needed the calories in her system before she did anything else. She spent 2 more days at the stone structure, ate winter root and the meat of 3 rabbits she snared with cords stripped from the interior lining of her coat, repaired her boot heel with a combination of pine resin and a strip of the same cord, slept in real increments, 4 hours, 5 hours, and let her body catch up on what the first 2 days had cost it. On the 5th day, she climbed the ridge. The view from the top of the ridge was the most terrifying thing she'd seen in her life, and she stood in the wind and looked at it and didn't look away. The frozen north opened out ahead of her in every direction she could see. Not just cold, not just white. The landscape was the kind of enormous that made you aware of your own size in a way that felt almost like a physical sensation. The tundra shelf running north for as far as she could see, broken only by the dark shapes of distant formations that could have been mountains or could have been clouds sitting low. The sky had merged with the land at the horizon in a way that removed the distinction between them. The wind up here was a different thing than the wind at tree level. It had a voice. Below her, barely visible at this distance, the border of Ashenvale's territory, the land she'd just crossed, the gate she'd walked through. She turned her face north and looked at what was waiting. "Okay," she said, to the wind, to the immensity, to herself. "Come on." She climbed down. 7 days out from Ashenvale, she found the second structure. This one wasn't a ruin. It wasn't maintained either. No smoke from the chimney, no tracks in the snow approaching it, no sign of recent occupation, but it was intact. Stone walls, all 4 standing, a roof that had been recently replaced, recently meaning within the last decade, with heavy timber beams and a sod cover that hadn't yet started to sag. A door that had a bar on the inside, not the outside, which meant whoever built it was thinking about having something to keep out rather than something to lock in. The door was not barred. She pushed it open with her shoulder and stood in the threshold and let her eyes adjust. Inside, a wood store that was much better stocked than the structure she'd already found. A folded pile of heavy fur blankets, marten or beaver, old but intact. 3 oil lamps. A storage box built into the north wall that contained, when she opened it, dried meat. She brought it to her nose and smelled it carefully. Deer, salted, and a cloth bag of grain that she couldn't immediately identify. In a sealed ceramic jar, something that smelled of rendered fat and herbs. She stood in the middle of this and felt the hair on her arms rise. This was a cache, not a habitation. Nobody lived here, but somebody was maintaining it. Somebody came here regularly enough to replenish the wood store and replace the roof and keep the stores stocked. She had two options: leave now, before whoever maintained this cache arrived, and lose access to resources she desperately needed, or stay and find out what she was dealing with. Lyra Vale was, whatever her former pack believed about her, not stupid. She stayed. She ate a measured portion of the dried meat and rationed the grain, and she arranged herself in the corner of the structure furthest from the door with her back to the wall and her knife in her hand, and she waited. She waited for 3 days. On the third night, she heard footsteps in the snow. More than one set, moving with the deliberate quiet of people who knew how to move in the north, which meant they'd been up here long enough that it was second nature. She heard them stop outside the door. Heard a voice, low, the words indistinct. Another voice responding. The door opened. The man who stepped through first was perhaps 60 years old, built like a standing stone, wearing furs that had been cut and layered with a knowledge of cold that made Lyra's pack-standard gear look like a costume. He had a short-handled axe at his belt, and he wasn't reaching for it, which told her he hadn't yet clocked her in the corner. But the woman who came in behind him had, because she stopped the moment she was through the doorway and said something sharp in a language Lyra didn't recognize. The man's eyes found her. They looked at each other. Lyra did not lower her knife. "I've used your stores," she said, slowly and clearly. "I'll work to replace what I took. I'm not leaving until I know what's north of this ridge." The man looked at the woman. The woman looked at Lyra. Then the woman said, in accented but perfectly legible common, "You came from below the line." "Yes." Nobody comes from below the line and stays alive for 3 days. "I've been alive 8 days. A pause. The woman's expression was not warm. It was the expression of a person doing rapid, unsentimental arithmetic. 8 days, she said. Alone. Yes. Across the tundra shelf? As far as this ridge. Another pause. The woman turned to the man and spoke in their language. He replied without taking his eyes off Lyra. His eyes were the color of glacier ice, she noticed. A specific shade of pale blue that she hadn't seen in a human face before, and the skin around them was deeply weathered in the way of someone who'd spent decades with the wind at their face. The woman turned back to her. "What did you do?" she said. "To make them put you out here?" Lyra held the woman's gaze. "The people who put me here," she said, "told a specific lie about a specific crime they needed me to take the weight of. I didn't do the thing they said I did, but the Alpha wanted me gone, so I'm gone. And you came north instead of dying." "I came north instead of dying." The woman was quiet for a moment that stretched into something that felt like assessment. "Most of the ones they exile," she said finally, "walk north and then stop. They sit down in the snow and they stop. We found the bodies. You walked and you kept walking. I had reasons to keep walking." "What reasons?" Lyra thought about Darren's flat eyes, about Goran's pre-concluded smile, about the young woman on the stand with her over-rehearsed testimony and her nervous hands, about 50 people watching her walk to the gate and not one voice. "I want to know who planted the evidence," she said. "I want to know why, and I want to still be alive when that becomes clear." The man spoke again. The woman listened, then looked at Lyra with an expression that had shifted just slightly. Not warm, still not warm, but something that was adjacent to respect in the same way that stone is adjacent to the earth it sits on. "He says you have the eyes of someone who knows they're going to survive," the woman said. "He says he's seen that twice in his life, both times in people who went on to do things that changed the shape of what we thought was possible." Lyra said nothing. "My name is Sabel," the woman said. "He is called Vaughn. We winter here, above the line. We are not pack. We follow no alpha." "I know what that means," Lyra said. "What does it mean up here?" "It means we are free," Sabel said. And it means we survive, or we don't, on our own terms. It means the North teaches you what you actually are, not what your pack decided you were. She paused. You said you want to know what's north of this ridge. Yes. Why? Lyra looked at the wall of the structure, at the dark stone fitted together without mortar by hands she didn't know, and then she looked back at Sable. Because whatever's north of this ridge is what I have instead of everything I had, and I need to know what I'm working with. Sable was quiet. Then she crossed the floor and sat down on the wood store opposite Lyra, and Vaughn came and sat beside her, and neither of them was pointing anything at Lyra, and neither of them was signaling departure. And after a moment, Sable said, North of the ridge is the deep shelf. 300 miles of it. Most of it will kill you in 6 ways before you can choose which one you prefer. But at the far end of the deep shelf, she paused. Vaughn and I have been north for 30 years. 30 years. We have seen things that the packs below the line would say are impossible. What things? There are places in the deep shelf where the ice is not ordinary ice. There are places where the cold is old, where it has been sitting for so long that it has become something else. She looked at Vaughn. We found a site 12 years ago in the center of the shelf. We stayed 3 days. We left because the things we felt there... She stopped. What things did you feel? Lyra asked. Sable looked at her for a long time. Power, she said. Not a word I use easily. Not a soft word. Something else. Something that asked you a question every time you got close to it. And the question was, what would you become if you stopped letting other people write the answer? The fire in the oil lamp flickered. The wind pressed against the structure's walls. Lyra's hand tightened on the knife she was still holding. Show me, she said. Before Sable could answer, before Vaughn could speak, before the wind outside could die or shift, before the next second could complete itself and carry them into whatever came next, something outside the structure made a sound. Not the wind, not an animal. The sound of a human body moving fast through snow, the specific crunch and compress of someone running, and running hard. And then the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, replaced by something Lyra's body recognized before her mind caught up. The chemical salt and iron signature on the air, the one that meant injury, the one that meant blood. And then a weight hit the door of the structure and the door held for 1 second, and then it burst open and a boy came through it. 16, maybe 17. Dark-haired, hollow-cheeked with the gauntness of someone who'd been running on nothing for days. Wearing pack clothes, not North Dweller furs, pack clothes, Ashenvale standard, and that made no sense. That made 0 sense, because nobody came up here from Ashenvale except the exiled, and she was the exiled. And his face, when he lifted it from where he'd fallen against the doorframe, was a face she knew. Bryn, the son of Ashenvale's head healer. 16 years old. The kid she'd treated for 3 separate injuries in the last 2 years, who used to sit in the healing house doorway on slow mornings and read, who'd smiled at her once with the uncomplicated warmth of a boy who hadn't yet learned that she was someone to look through. He'd run for 8 days. She could see it on him. She could see it in the blown-out eyes and the torn hands and the blood on his left side that had dried brown and reopened somewhere in the last few hours because there was fresh red beneath the brown. Luna, he said. The word came out like he'd rehearsed it through 8 days of running, and now that he was saying it, he didn't know what came next. Luna, you have to... He coughed, caught himself on the doorframe. Bryn. She was already up, already crossing to him, knife put away without deciding to put it away, hands going to his face to check his eyes, because the cough sounded wet, and the wet ones were the ones that mattered. Bryn, how did you find me? I tracked you. He was shaking, the full body shaking of someone whose system was finally letting itself react now that it had reached something it had defined as safety. I've been tracking since the second day. I know the North reading. My mother taught me. Luna. I'm not Luna anymore. Lyra. Just Lyra. She was checking the wound on his side, pulling the coat back from it with careful hands. Deep. Not fatal if it was treated in the next few hours. Not immediately fatal, anyway. What happened? Why are you here? They're going to attack Ashenvale, Bryn said. She stopped. Who? The Lowfall. The ones they said you... The ones Garan said. It was Garan. He grabbed her wrist with a hand that had no warmth left in it. It was Goran all along, the whole thing. He's been feeding the Lowfall information for 2 years, and when they were ready to move, he needed you out of the way because you would have found the discrepancies in the patrol schedules and you would have traced them, and he couldn't have that, so he... Another cough, worse this time. They're coming. 300 fighters. They move in 12 days, and Darren... Lyra's hands had gone still on his side. Darren doesn't know, Bryn said, or he knows something is wrong and he doesn't know what. He's been... The boy's eyes found hers, and she saw in them the particular grief of someone very young who's just had something confirmed that they'd hoped wasn't true. He's been asking about you since the 4th day, quietly. Nobody was supposed to know. The wind outside hit the structure and the oil lamp flame went flat, and then came back, and Sable and Vaughn were watching her from across the room with the same expression. The expression of 2 people watching someone stand at the exact edge of a decision they can't make for her. Bryn's hand was still on her wrist, cold as stone, but holding. Luna, he said, Lyra, they sent me because I'm the only one who would come. Because the others are too afraid or too, I don't know, too whatever. But I came because you are the only person who ever looked at me like I was the whole of what I was, and not just a kid in the doorway. He swallowed. And because Ashenvale is going to be ash in 12 days if someone doesn't do something, and the only person I can think of who might actually... He stopped. He looked at her. Lyra looked back at him, and behind him at the open door, and beyond the open door at the north, pressing against the world like something enormous and patient, and she felt all of it at once. The hollow in her chest that had been Darren's absence, the 8 days of cold and fear and dogged forward motion, Sable's words about what was north of the ridge, and the power that asked its question, and this boy's frozen hand on her wrist, and 12 days, and 300 fighters, and everything she thought she'd walked away from waiting on the other side of the same gate she'd just walked through. How badly, she said quietly, do you want to live through the next 12 days? Bryn blinked. Then slowly, more than anything. Good. She put pressure on his wound and he hissed between his teeth, and she didn't apologize for it because it needed pressure. Then stop talking and let me think. Outside, the north wind dropped to absolute silence. In that silence, the total pressurized silence of the frozen north when it holds its breath. Sable looked at Vaughn, and Vaughn looked back, and neither of them spoke. Because what they were watching was the kind of moment that didn't need commentary. It announced itself. And somewhere below the ridge, somewhere at the precise edge of what the deep shelf's ancient cold could reach, something shifted in the ice, like recognition, like something very old and very patient, waking up. The silence outside lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then the north wind came back, harder than before, and Bryn flinched at the sound of it, and Lyra's hands were already moving. Pressure on the wound, assessing depth, assessing the color of what was seeping through the dried blood, her mind running 2 tracks simultaneously the way it always had in the healing house. 1 track purely clinical, and 1 track somewhere colder and more deliberate than anything she'd operated from before. Lamp, she said. Sabelle moved without being asked. She'd taken the measure of the situation in the time it took Bryn to finish his last sentence, and she was already bringing the nearest oil lamp close, holding it steady, angling the light. Vaughn closed the door. Lyra peeled back the coat from Bryn's side and looked at what was underneath. The wound was a blade cut. Clean entry, not a puncture, which was better. Approximately 4 inches long across the left ribs. Deep enough to matter. Not deep enough to have hit anything vital, or he wouldn't have been standing. The dried blood had done some of the work of sealing it. The fresh blood was from movement reopening the outer layer. "Who did this?" she said. "Border Patrol." Bryn's voice was steadier now that he was horizontal. She'd put him down on the floor without quite deciding to, and he'd gone without resistance. 2 days out from Ashenvale. They weren't supposed to stop me. I had pack scent, but the patrol captain is one of Goran's men, and I think Goran knew I'd run. And he knew you'd run, Lyra said. I think he saw me. In the records room, before I left. She looked up from the wound. You went to the records room. I needed proof. Not just what I'd overheard. I needed something you could use. He reached inside his coat with the arm that wasn't on the injured side and pulled out a folded piece of oilskin. I copied what I could before he came in. I don't know if it's enough. She took the oilskin, unfolded it carefully. The handwriting inside was a boy's handwriting, hurried and cramped, but legible. Dates, names, numbers that corresponded to patrol schedule modifications. And at the bottom of the third page, a name that made her go very still. Not Goran's name. A name above Goran's. She refolded the oilskin and held it against her knee for a moment and did not say anything. What is it? Sabel said. Information, Lyra said. The expensive kind. She put the oilskin inside her own coat and went back to the wound. This needs to be cleaned and closed, she said. We have fat and herbs in the storage box. Sable, is any of that yarrow in the herb jar or something close to it? Mountain wort, Sable said. Works the same. Bring it. Bryn looked at the ceiling of the structure while she worked. His jaw was set hard and he was breathing through his nose in the controlled way of someone managing pain by refusing to acknowledge that it's the thing they're managing. You're angry, he said. I'm focused. Those aren't always different. She pressed a cloth soaked in rendered fat and mountain wort against the wound, and he made a sound that was not quite a word. She held the pressure steady. Tell me, she said, exactly what you overheard. From the beginning. Don't skip anything because you think it's small. He told her. It took 20 minutes. She listened without interrupting, which was a discipline she'd learned in the healing house. People told you more when you didn't steer them, when you let the account move at its own pace and find its own shape. The shape of what Bryn had overheard was a plan that had been running for 2 years, methodical and patient, built on the assumption that Ashenvale's leadership was too comfortable and too proud to imagine something growing in its own foundations. Goran had not acted alone. That was the part that mattered. Goran was smart enough to be dangerous, but not smart enough to have constructed this. Someone above him had constructed this, had identified Ashenvale's value to the low-fall, had opened the first channels of communication, had decided which information to pass and when, had engineered the accusation against Lyra with a precision that required both knowledge of pack law and the kind of access to alpha-level communications that suggested someone who moved freely at that level. The name at the bottom of the oilskin page. She pressed it down and thought about it later. The 12 days, she said. You're certain? I'm certain of what I heard. I heard 12 days from the night I left. That was 8 days ago. 4 days. 4 days. Maybe less if they moved early. She finished closing the wound with strips of cloth from the supply box, tied off with the clean, efficient knots of someone who'd done this in worse conditions with worse materials. She sat back on her heels and looked at Bryn, and he looked back at her with the hollow eyes of a boy who'd run 8 days through the frozen north on a wound and a hope and not much else. You could have died getting here, she said. I know. You understood that when you left. Yes. Why? Not an accusation. A genuine question. She needed to understand the mechanism of it. Bryn was quiet for a moment, then, because you treated me like I was the whole of what I was. I said that already. That's not enough to die for. No. He looked at the ceiling. But it's enough to run for. And I figured if I got here and gave you the information and then died, at least the information was somewhere it could be used. At least it wasn't just sitting in Ashenvale with everyone pretending they didn't know what they knew. Lyra held that. The fire in the lamp burned. Outside, the north pressed its weight against the stone walls. Sleep, she said. 4 hours. Then we talk about what comes next. What does come next? She stood up. I'm still working on that. She didn't sleep. Subble came and sat beside her while Bryn's breathing evened out into the deep rhythm of genuine exhaustion, finally allowed to take over, and Vaughn kept the fire and said nothing, which was its own form of participation. Lyra unfolded the oilskin again. Read it again in the lamplight. The name at the bottom was Counselor Aldrich, Darren's own second-seat council member, The man who'd sat at Darren's right hand for 11 years, who'd been in the room for every significant decision Ashenvale had made in over a decade, who'd attended every single session of Lyra's own council responsibilities, and who had been, she now understood, assessing every one of those sessions for what could be extracted and passed along. "You know who it is?" Sabel said. "I know who one of them is. There are probably others. Does it change what you're going to do?" Lyra looked at the name for another moment. Then she folded the oilskin and put it back against her chest. "I'm not going back to save Ashenvale," she said. "I need to be clear about that. I'm not going back to pull Darren's territory out of a fire he helped build by choosing blindness. I'm not going back to be thanked, and then handed back my title, and expected to be grateful." "What are you going back for?" "I'm not going back yet." She looked at Sabel. "You said there are places in the deep shelf where the cold is old, where something lives in it that asked you a question." Sabel was quiet. "How far?" Lyra said. 3 days north of this ridge, hard terrain. I have 4 days before the lowfall moves, maybe. 3 days there leaves you 1 day to get back to the border. That's not... Sabel?" Lyra looked at her directly. "What did you feel at that site? Specifically?" Sabel looked at Vaughn. Something passed between them that was 30 years long. "Like being known," Sabel said finally. "Like something very old looked at exactly what you were and did not flinch. And then it offered..." She stopped. "I don't have the right word for it. It wasn't power like a weapon. It was power like a door." "A door to what?" "Whatever you needed to become." Lyra sat with that. What she needed to become. Not what Ashenvale needed her to be. Not what Darren had needed. What she needed. She thought about Bryn's 8 days of running. She thought about Goran's smile with its preloaded conclusion. She thought about the young woman on the stand with her rehearsed testimony. She thought about the name at the bottom of the oilskin page and what it meant about the depth of the rot in a place she'd spent 6 years trying to serve faithfully. She thought about the thing that had shifted in the ice when she'd asked Bryn how badly he wanted to survive. "We leave at first light," she said. "You and Vaughn guide me to the site. Bryn stays here with supplies and the door barred until we come back." "And if we don't come back?" "Then Bryn takes what's in the supply box and goes south and does what he can with the information he's carrying." She looked at Sabel. "But we're coming back." Sabel looked at her for a long time. "Vaughn," she said, without looking away from Lyra. Vaughn said one word in their language. "He says yes," Sabel said. "He says he's been waiting 30 years for someone to go back to that site and not run from it." "What made you run?" Sabel smiled. It was not a soft smile. "We weren't ready," she said. "The question it asked, we weren't ready to answer it yet." "What's the question?" "You'll know it when it asks you." She stood, brushing off her furs. "Sleep, Lyra. What's north of that ridge doesn't reward exhaustion." Dang it. She slept 2 hours. She hadn't intended to, but her body made the decision without consulting her. And when she woke, the lamp had burned low, and Bryn was still out, and Sabel and Vaughn were already moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had been waking before light for 30 years. She briefed Bryn before they left. He was awake. She suspected he hadn't slept as deeply as he'd appeared to, and he listened without interrupting, which reminded her uncomfortably of herself at 16. The particular discipline of a young person who understood that interrupting adults in the middle of important sentences had costs. "Bar the door," she said. "Don't open it for anything except my voice or Sabel's voice. Not pack call, not distress sounds, nothing. If we're not back in 4 days, you take everything in the supply box and you head south. You find the nearest neutral territory, you show the oilskin to whoever leads it, and you tell them what's coming. And if they don't listen, make them listen." She looked at him. "You ran 8 days through the frozen north on a blade wound. You have more capacity to make people listen than you currently believe." Bryn's jaw tightened. He nodded once. She turned and went out into the pre-dawn dark. Boom. The terrain north of the ridge was a different world. She'd thought she understood cold. 8 days in the north had given her a working understanding of cold. The way it moved, the way it found gaps, the way it pressed. The terrain north of the ridge renegotiated every assumption. The tundra shelf was not flat. It rolled and broke and dropped in ways that the low light made treacherous, sudden descents into sheltered basins where the snow was different, finer, denser, with a crystalline quality she hadn't seen before, and then long climbs out onto exposed ridgelines where the wind moved with the force of something intentional. Sable moved through it like water finding a course. Vaughn moved like stone, not fast, but with an absolute certainty of placement that meant he never wasted a step. Lyra moved between them and watched both and adapted, and after the first 2 hours her body had found its own version of their rhythm, not identical, but functional. They didn't talk much. The terrain didn't allow for it, and the wind took words away before they landed. Sybil communicated with hand signals and brief pointed gestures, and Lyra decoded them with the focus of someone who understood that miscommunication up here had immediate physical consequences. On the second day, they dropped into a basin that was so sheltered the wind disappeared entirely, and in the silence the cold was somehow worse, more present, more specific, the kind of cold that pressed from every direction rather than coming at you from one side. The snow in the basin was the fine crystalline type she'd noticed before, and it caught the flat gray light in a way that made the floor of the basin look like it was faintly luminous. "We stop here tonight," Sybil said. "How far tomorrow?" "Half a day. Maybe less." She looked at the basin around them. "The site is at the north edge of the next shelf. You'll know you're close before you see it." "How?" Sybil considered. "The cold changes. There's cold, and then there's what's there. You'll feel the difference." They made camp in the basin with the practiced efficiency of the three of them having now established a working pattern. Vaughn handled the fire and the structure, Sybil handled food, Lyra handled the details that fell between those two categories, which were always the details that determined whether a camp was survivable or merely uncomfortable. She repacked her boot lining with moss from the dried bundle in her coat pocket. She checked the oilskin. She counted forward to what was waiting on the other side of this. 4 days since Bryn's arrival. 3 days of travel. The math was getting tight. Sable sat across the small fire from her and looked into it. "Can I ask you something?" Lyra said. "You can ask." "The question it asked you, at the site. You said you weren't ready to answer it, 30 years later. Are you ready now?" Sybil was quiet for long enough that Lyra thought she might not answer. "I'm ready," Sable said. "I'm just not the one it wants." She looked up from the fire. "Some doors open for specific people. The rest of us just get to see which direction they face." "You think I'm one of those people?" "I think you walked 8 days through the frozen north on no provisions with a severed mate bond and came out the other side making plans." Sybil's voice was even, uninflected. "I think that's a specific kind of person. Yes." The fire crackled. Vaughn said something low and Sybil responded, and they lapsed into their language. And Lyra looked north across the basin at the shelf rising to meet the gray sky, and she felt it, for the first time distinct and unambiguous, something she'd been half feeling since the ridge and half attributing to cold and exhaustion and the heightened perception that came with survival conditions. A pull. Not metaphorical, actual. A directional sensation in her chest that was nothing like the hollow of the severed mate bond, and everything unlike anything she had a word for. Like the hollow was being answered from somewhere north, like whatever had scooped that space out of her had left an opening that something else was now moving toward from the other side. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum and held it there. The basin was silent. The cold was very specific. On the third morning, she woke before Sybil and Vaughn. She lay still for a moment and registered the quality of the silence, different from the night silence, different even from the basin's particular sheltered quiet. She sat up. The sky to the north was doing something she had no reference for. It wasn't the ordinary flat gray of the shelf's overcast. It was, she couldn't find another word for it, awake. The light coming from that direction was not sunlight, wasn't moon, wasn't anything with a clear source. It was simply more present than the light in other directions, the way a face across a dark room is more present than the furniture. She was on her feet before she decided to stand. Sybil was watching her from across the dead fire. "You feel it," Sybil said. "Yes." "How long?" "Since the basin." Sybil nodded as if this confirmed something. "That's sooner than most." Vaughn didn't feel it until we were an hour out. Lyra looked at the northern sky. The quality of light there was doing something to the space beneath her sternum. Not painful, not comfortable, operating in a register that was outside both of those categories. The way a sound below audible frequency registers as pressure rather than noise. She turned to look at Sabel. "Tell me what to do when we get there." "Nothing," Sabel said. "That's the whole answer. Don't perform. Don't try to take it. Don't ask it for anything specific." She paused. "It doesn't respond to want. It responds to what you actually are, underneath what you've been told you are. And if what I actually am isn't enough?" Sabel stood and began breaking camp with the efficiency of long practice, not answering immediately. Then, without looking up from what her hands were doing, "You walked out of Ashenvale's gate with your spine straight on the day they threw you away. You survived 8 days alone. You took in a wounded boy and made a plan within 20 minutes of hearing news that would have broken most people." She glanced up. "I think your actual problem is the opposite of not being enough." "What's the opposite problem?" Sabel looked at her steadily. "Not knowing what to do with how much you are. Once you do." She went back to breaking camp. Lyra stood in the cold basin light and held that sentence at arm's length and looked at it. And somewhere in the looking, she stopped being afraid of what was north of the next ridge. Not because the fear went away, because it became irrelevant. They reached the site at midday. She knew it before she saw it, exactly as Sable had said. The cold changed. At a distance of perhaps a quarter mile from the edge of the upper shelf, the cold stopped being a condition of the environment and became something that was specifically directed toward her or toward whatever she was at the center of, pressing in with the focused intention of something that had been waiting long enough that it had developed opinions about the wait. She kept walking. Vaughn stopped at the base of the shelf incline. He looked at her, and she understood. This was as far as he went. Not from fear, from the same knowledge a person has when they understand a thing is not for them. Sabel walked with her up the incline. At the top of the incline, the shelf opened onto a plateau, and in the center of the plateau was the site. It was not dramatic. That was the first thing she registered. She'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something visible, something that announced itself. What was there was simply a section of the plateau floor that was different from the rest. The ice here was darker, older, with the deep blue-black color of glacial ice that had been compressed for centuries, and at its center, perhaps 20 yards across, the surface was not flat. It was shaped, not by human hands, by pressure, by time, by the specific physics of ice that has been accumulating and compressing and responding to temperature for long enough that it develops a character. The character of this ice was very clear. It was waiting. She felt Sable stop behind her. She felt the perimeter of whatever this was, the place where the directed cold was strongest, approximately 10 yards from the dark ice's edge. She walked across it. The moment she stepped onto the dark ice, she understood what Sable had meant about a question. It wasn't a question in words. It wasn't a question in sensation. It was more like an attention, a very old, very thorough attention that looked at her from the inside out, that examined everything she was made of in the same way you examine a stone wall to find where the weaknesses are, except the examination was not hostile. It was clinical. What are you actually? Not what they said you were, not what you were assigned. What is the actual material of you, and what does that material become under sufficient pressure? She stood in the center of the dark ice and let it look. She did not perform. She did not ask for anything. She stood with her spine straight and her hands open at her sides and let it examine exactly what Ashenvale had produced when it threw a woman away and assumed she'd stop moving. The cold went through her, not into her. Through her, the way wind goes through a structure to find what's solid, to map the architecture. She felt it move through tissue and bone and the ragged hollow where the mate bond had been torn out, and through the grief, and through the specific anger that had been burning clean and hot under the grief since the second day, and through something beneath all of that which she had never had a name for, the deep cold thing that had always been in her, the part of her that had survived 6 years of erasure by going underground, by staying quiet, by waiting. It found that. It stayed there. And then the dark ice cracked. Not catastrophically. A single clean fracture, running from beneath her feet outward in 4 directions simultaneously, like a compass rose, like something fundamental was being marked. And from the fracture a cold rose that was entirely different from the cold of the shelf, older, more specific, with a quality of pressure that she felt in her teeth and her fingertips and the base of her skull. It moved into the hollow in her chest, not replacing what had been there, filling a different space, a space she hadn't known existed until this moment, a space that had apparently been waiting since before she had words for waiting. She heard herself exhale. The exhale turned to frost in the air in front of her face, which was not unusual in the deep north. What was unusual was that the frost did not disperse. It hung in the air and expanded outward, slowly, and the temperature around her dropped 12 degrees in 4 seconds, and the snow on the plateau surface began to move, not blown, not drifting, moving with a directionality that came from her, radiating from the point where she was standing, responding to something she hadn't consciously done, but that her body had done independently, the way a lung expands without instruction. She looked at her own hands. The ice forming at the edges of her fingernails was dark, the same deep blue-black of the glacial ice beneath her feet. She looked up. Sabel was at the plateau's edge, perfectly still, watching her with an expression that Lyra could not have described in any register she'd previously operated in. And from behind Sabel, from the shelf incline, came Vaughn's voice, urgent, clipped, the specific tone of someone delivering information that has no time for preamble. Sabel turned sharply. Lyra watched her listen to whatever Vaughn was saying, watched Sabel's face change. Lyra. Sabel's voice, across the plateau, was careful and flat with controlled urgency. We need to move. What is it? Vaughn tracked movement on the southern approach. Pack formation, large one. She felt the new cold thing in her chest go absolutely still. How large? Sabel looked at Vaughn again, back at her. 200 fighters, Sabel said, moving north. Not low-fall formation. Ashenvale colors. The dark ice under Lyra's feet cracked again. The frost in the air around her had spread to a 6-foot radius without her telling it to. They're not coming for the low-fall, she said. It was not a question. The new cold thing in her chest looked at the shape of the information and reached its own conclusion in the same flat, efficient way she'd reached conclusions for 6 years in the healing house. And the conclusion was this. Goran knew Bryn had run. Goran knew where Bryn had run to, and Goran had calculated that a woman who'd been in the frozen north for 12 days, injured and unsupplied, was not a problem. But a woman who'd been in the north 12 days and was still moving, still thinking, still being found by runaway boys who carried documented evidence of treason, that was a different calculation entirely. 200 fighters. Not to stop the low fall. To stop her. And behind her, somewhere she could feel without turning to look, the glacial dark ice was doing something new. Expanding, contracting slightly, the deep shelf cold pulling inward like a breath before a word. Like the moment before a storm speaks its first syllable. She turned to face it. Her hands were dark at the edges, and her breath made frost that didn't disperse, and the temperature in her immediate radius had dropped in a way that Sabel and Vaughn could certainly feel from where they stood. She had 4 days, maybe less. 200 fighters between her and the southern border. A boy barricaded in a stone structure with a wound and a piece of oilskin and instructions she'd given him, assuming she'd be back in 4 days. She looked at what was in her hands. She looked at what the deep shelf had put in her chest. The winter around her was hers. She understood that now. Not as metaphor, not as feeling, but as simple fact. The way you understand that your hands are yours. The cold was hers. The frost was hers. Whatever the dark ice had recognized in her and responded to was hers, and had probably always been hers, waiting under everything else for the conditions that would call it out. Those conditions were called having nothing left to lose and everything left to build. She walked off the dark ice. The cold came with her. She came off the plateau at a run. Not panic. She wasn't running from anything yet. She was running toward the decision she'd already made before her feet left the dark ice. The decision that had assembled itself in the 3 seconds between Sabel's words and the moment Lyra's body started moving. 200 fighters moving north in Ashenvale colors meant Goran had accelerated his timeline. It meant Bryn had been right about being seen in the records room. It meant the 4 days she'd calculated had just become something considerably shorter, and the only question worth asking was how far ahead of that column she currently was. "How fast are they moving?" she said to Vaughn as she reached the incline base. Sybil translated. Vaughn answered with 3 words and held up 2 fingers. 2 hours behind us, Sybil said. Maybe less. They're moving fast for a pack formation. No supply carts, no camp equipment. This is a strike column. They're not planning to stay. No. She looked south along the shelf. The basin they'd camped in was an hour back. The ridge was 2 hours beyond that. Bryn was another half-hour past the ridge in the stone structure, and if he'd followed her instructions, the door was barred, and he was sitting in the dark with his wound and his oilskin, waiting on a timeline that had just been compressed without his knowledge. She ran the math and didn't like any of the numbers. Sybil. She turned to face the older woman directly. Can you get Bryn out? South, around the column. Is there a route that avoids the main shelf approach? Sybil and Vaughn exchanged a look that contained the full weight of 30 years of shared navigation. There's a route, Sybil said carefully, through the eastern drainage. It adds 6 hours, but it avoids the column. If they're not running scouts east, we don't know that they're not. Lyra looked at her. Will you try? Sybil held her gaze for a long moment, and then she did something unexpected. She reached out and gripped Lyra's forearm with both hands, brief and firm, the grip of someone who has assessed a situation and made a decision they intend to stand behind. We'll get the boy out, she said. What are you going to do? Lyra looked south along the shelf toward the approaching column she couldn't yet see. I'm going to let them find me, she said. She chose her ground with the same methodical care she'd chosen firewood and camp positions for the last 12 days. The habit of survival was beginning to feel like a second nervous system. She didn't have to think about the process. Her body had absorbed it, and what had once required deliberate calculation was now simply perception. Good ground, bad ground. Where the wind came from, where a person standing at a distance would have the light behind them or against them. She found a shelf depression 200 yards south of the plateau edge, where the terrain created a natural bowl that would funnel anyone approaching from the south into a specific entry point. She stood in the center of the bowl and waited, and she felt the cold around her respond to her stillness the way it had on the dark ice. Not disappearing, not becoming inert, but settling into a kind of readiness that was distinctly different from ambient temperature. She was still learning what she was. That was the honest truth of it. Whatever the deep shelf had put in her chest was not yet fluent in what she needed it to do. She could feel it, the cold that was hers rather than the cold that was simply environmental, the two things distinct and separately addressable in a way that hadn't existed before the plateau. But feeling it and controlling it were not the same thing, and she knew enough about new capacities to know that the worst possible time to discover their limits was in the middle of a situation that required them to be limitless. She had what she had. She would use it the way she'd always used everything she had, precisely, without waste, without performance. The column appeared on the southern approach 40 minutes after she'd taken her position. They were moving in formation. Good formation, actually. She noted it with the detached professional part of her mind that had spent 6 years as Luna observing pack operations. Pairs flanking a central line, enforcers at the perimeter, a command cluster in the middle. The kind of formation you used when you were moving fast but expected contact. Someone in that column had tactical competence. Someone in the command cluster had white hair. Elder Goran. He was riding a dark horse, which was a significant organizational statement. Horses were not common in Ashenvale's North operations, and bringing one this far into the shelf terrain meant he'd intended to project a specific image: authority, permanence. The image of a man who had already decided how this ended. She saw the moment the advance scout spotted her. 2 pack members at the formation's front edge stopped moving, and one of them raised a hand. The column slowed, then stopped. She stood in the bowl and let them look. The walk of a commanding figure from the center of the formation to its front edge. She watched Goran maneuver his horse through the column and emerge at its head. And she noticed the other figure emerging beside him. Not a fighter. Not an enforcer. Aldrich. Counselor Aldrich, Darren's second seat, who'd sat at Lyra's own council sessions for 6 years and said exactly the right things at exactly the right times and never once revealed what was underneath. She held very still. Goran stopped his horse at the rim of the bowl and looked down at her. "You're harder to kill than I anticipated," he said. His voice was the same voice she'd heard in the Alpha's hall, measured, paternal, the voice of a man who'd spent decades performing reasonableness so consistently that he'd nearly convinced himself it was his actual character. "You didn't send enough people," she said. "We sent the standard exile provisions." He spread one hand. The North was supposed to handle the rest. "The North and I came to an arrangement." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes moved to her hands. She didn't look down, but she knew what he was seeing, the dark edge at her fingernails, the frost that moved around her at a distance that didn't match the wind. Something in his expression recalibrated. "Aldrich said you might find the site," he said. She looked at Aldrich then, directly. Aldrich met her gaze with the equanimity of a man who'd stopped needing to pretend some time ago. He was perhaps 55, unremarkably built, with a face that she'd always read as wise and was now reading as simply well-constructed, a face designed to project whatever a given room needed to see from it. "You knew about the site," she said. "I've known about the site for 8 years, Aldrich said. His voice was conversational. "The North Dwellers talk, if you know how to listen. Rumor of a power source in the deep shelf. Something that responds to specific individuals. And you didn't want me to reach it. I wanted many things not to happen, Lyra. This is one of them." He looked at her hands, at the frost. "Although I see I miscalculated the timing." The cold in her chest was very still, not absent, present in a way that was specific and directional, the way a held breath is more present than an ordinary one. She could feel the temperature differential between herself and the air around her. She could feel it in the ground beneath her boots, the upper layer of the snowpack within her radius responding to something she was generating without deciding to generate it. She pulled it back, deliberately, with effort. Not because she was afraid of it, because she needed to understand what she was looking at before she used anything. "Where is Darren?" she said. Goran's expression did something complicated. "The Alpha is managing a situation at the western border." "What situation?" "One we created," Aldrich said pleasantly. "A border dispute with Crestfall, minor, resolvable. But it required his personal attention, and it required him to be 3 days' ride from Ashenvale when certain things were set in motion." She looked at Aldrich and took the full measure of what she was hearing. Darren didn't know about the column. Darren didn't know about the exile being engineered. Darren had been managed, carefully, over years, by a man who sat at his right hand and who had become so central to his decision-making that removing the man would have felt like removing a wall, which meant the man could lean on that wall himself, and Darren would feel the steadiness and not understand what it meant. Darren's flat eyes at the gate, his silence during the accusation, his "this isn't personal, Lyra," not cruelty, not conspiracy, blindness, the most expensive blindness in the world. "He doesn't know," she said. "He knows what we've arranged for him to know," Goran said, "which is sufficient. The low fall is moving in 4 days. Something shifted in Goran's face. Brief, gone in a second, but she'd been watching for it. "And you arranged that too," she said. "You opened those channels. You passed the patrol schedules. You were always going to let them take Ashenvale. You just needed me out of the way first because I would have found the discrepancy in the records." "You always were thorough," Goran said. The word was not a compliment. "Inconveniently so. And when the low fall takes Ashenvale, you're positioned to negotiate the terms. You've already promised them something in exchange for your own safety. Probably territory. Probably council authority under the new structure." Goran looked at her steadily. "You're describing a set of decisions that a reasonable man makes when the alternative is being subject to an Alpha whose judgment has been declining for 3 years and a Luna whose competencies exceeded her social position to a degree that was becoming disruptive." "My competencies disrupted you." "Your competencies," he said, "made the pack nervous. A Luna who knows the records better than the Elders. A Luna who can name every provision discrepancy for the last 4 years. A Luna who asks questions in council sessions that nobody can answer without admitting things they'd rather not admit. He looked at her without warmth, but also without hatred, with the flat pragmatism of someone who has moved a piece on a board and is explaining the reasoning. You were never going to be permitted to reach your potential in Ashenvale. The pack structure doesn't survive that. She stood in the bowl with 200 fighters behind the man, and the cold pulling tight against her skin, and the dark thing in her chest very quiet and very awake, and she felt the truth of what he was saying land with the specific weight of something that has been true for a long time and has only just been stated aloud. He wasn't wrong. That was the part that cut. He was a trader and a strategist, and a man who'd spent 8 years engineering the quiet dismantling of everything she'd tried to build. And he wasn't wrong about what Ashenvale would have done to her even without his interference. The pack would have found another way. The structure would have found another way. You couldn't be what she was inside something designed to keep that particular shape contained. You had to break the container or leave it. They'd chosen for her which one it would be. So what happens now, she said. Now, Goran said, you tell me what the site gave you, because you were on it long enough that something happened. I can see it from here, and I need to understand the scope of it before I make the next decision. And what's the next decision? He looked at her. His horse shifted under him, and he stilled it with a knee without looking down. Whether you're more useful managed or removed. The cold snapped. She hadn't decided to do it. Her body did it the way it had done the frost on the plateau. Independently, below the level of instruction, responding to something the conscious mind was still processing. The temperature in the bowl dropped 20 degrees in the time it took her to exhale, and the snow around her feet rose in a wave that was not wind-driven, not momentum-driven, radiating outward from her like a pulse. The horses at the column's front screamed. Goran's horse reared and he stayed on it, barely, by the grip of a man with 30 years of horsemanship, and Aldrich's horse shied left and Aldrich went sideways and caught the saddle and hung there, while the animal tried to find its footing on suddenly ice-glazed ground. She hadn't thrown anything. She hadn't projected anything toward them. The cold had simply expressed itself, and the expression had radius. She pulled it back again. The temperature climbed. The ice on the ground remained. The silence in the bowl was the silence of 200 people reassessing. Goran brought his horse to stillness. His face was controlled, but his hands on the reins were not quite controlled. White-knuckled, she could see it from where she stood, and the knuckles said what the face refused to. Managed, he said, very quietly. The decision is managed. That's not your decision anymore, Lyra said. You can't fight 200. I'm not fighting anyone. She looked at the column behind him. She'd been watching their faces during the temperature drop. Most of them had stepped back. Not all, but most. I'm giving you a count of 10 to tell me where Darren is and what the actual low-fall timeline is. Because Bryn brought me documentation, Goran. Names, dates, schedule modifications, and whatever you think you've arranged with Aldrich and the low fall and the border distraction. It only works if I'm dead or contained, and you've just established that neither of those is as straightforward as you anticipated. Aldrich had righted himself on his horse. He was looking at Lyra with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in 6 years of council meetings, because it was an expression he'd never had reason to direct at her before. Actual attention, not the performed attention of a man managing a room, attention that meant he was revising something. She's right, Aldrich said to Goran. Goran looked at him sharply. The documentation changes the calculus, Aldrich said, with the same conversational evenness he'd used throughout. If it reaches neutral territory, or if it reaches Darren before the low fall moves, the arrangement with the low fall becomes significantly more complicated. Then we secure the documentation. The documentation left this shelf 3 hours ago, Lyra said. The silence that followed was a different kind than the one after the temperature drop. That silence had been physical. This one was the silence of arithmetic. Goran looked at her. You sent the boy south. Before I went to the plateau, I sent him with instructions to go south through the eastern drainage and find neutral territory if I wasn't back in 4 days. She held Goran's gaze. That was 4 days ago. It was not 4 days ago. It was, by her count, somewhere between 2 and 3 days. But she had learned from 6 years of council sessions that the specific moment to state a fact with the most authority is the moment when the other party has no way to verify it. Something moved across Goran's face that was, for the first time, not performance. His jaw tightened, his hands readjusted on the reins. His eyes moved to Aldrich and then back to Lyra, and she saw him doing the math, running the variables, finding that the variables had shifted beneath him in the time it took a boy to run south through the dark. "This doesn't change what you're facing," he said. His voice had lost something. Not composure, but the quality beneath composure. The certainty that the room was arranged the way he'd arranged it. "No," she agreed, "but it changes what you're facing." She looked at the column behind him. 200 pack members who had been told, she would guess, that they were containing a rogue exile who'd accessed a dangerous north site, who had not been told about Lowfall, who had not been told about Aldrich, who had been told the minimum necessary to move them in the right direction without requiring their actual understanding of the situation, people who were managed rather than led. She understood the distinction now in a way she hadn't when she'd been inside the structure doing the managing. "You have 3 days before the Lowfall moves," she said to the column, past Goran and Aldrich, addressing the fighters directly, watching them react to being addressed directly. "Your elder has been passing your patrol schedules to the Lowfall for 2 years. Your alpha is at the western border managing a distraction that was manufactured to remove him from Ashenvale before the attack. Your homes are in the path of what's coming." She let that sit. "That's the situation you're in. Not me. You," Goran said sharply. "Don't. Counselor." The voice came from inside the column. A fighter. Young, dark-haired, with the build of someone who'd grown up doing real work. What is she talking about? What Lowfall movement? "This is not the appropriate context for I'm asking you a direct question." The fighter stepped forward from the line. Others shifted. The formation wasn't breaking, but it was softening in the specific way formations soften when the people in them remember that they're people rather than formation components. "Sir, what does she mean about patrol schedules?" Goran looked at the fighter, then at Lyra. In his eyes, she saw the moment he made a decision. He turned his horse, and he said something low to Aldrich, and Aldrich turned his horse as well. And for half a second, Lyra thought she'd miscalculated, that he was going to ride south, abandon the column, let the situation play out on a different board. Instead, Aldrich reached into his coat. He moved fast, faster than a man of 55 on a horse should be able to move, and what came out of his coat was a crossbow bolt held in one hand, and his other hand was moving to his mouth, and he said something in a tongue she didn't know, and the bolt came up and she felt the cold clench, her cold, the North's cold, the old thing in her chest. And she didn't decide what to do with it, but it did something anyway. The air between her and Aldrich went white. Not a wall, not a projection. A sudden crystallization of the moisture in that 10-foot column of air, ice forming from vapor in 1 second. A sheet of it dense enough to catch the bolt that had just left Aldrich's hand and stop it 8 inches from her face. The bolt hung in the ice. Lyra looked at it. The column was silent with the specific silence of people who have witnessed something outside their known framework and have not yet decided how to incorporate it. She looked at Aldrich. His expression had moved past revision into something that had no council room precedent. She looked at the bolt embedded in her ice sheet. The tip of it was black, not metal dark. A specific black that she recognized from 3 years of working with poisons in the healing house. A compound that worked on contact, that didn't require a wound, that someone had put on the tip of a crossbow bolt meant to hit her in the face. She looked back at Aldrich. "You were never going to manage me," she said. He met her eyes, and for 1 second he was simply a man who'd done a calculation and found it had come out wrong. Then the dark-haired fighter in the column shouted something, and 2 others pulled Aldrich off his horse, and Goran's horse lurched and he fought it, and the formation fractured. Not into chaos, into the specific fracture of a group of people who have just received information that rearranges their understanding of whose side they're on. Lyra stood in the center of the bowl. The bolt hung in her ice. The cold around her was hers, and it was old and patient, and it had been waiting as she had been waiting for the conditions that would call it out of the ground. She had 3 days, 200 fighters who were no longer certain of their orders. A column without functional command. A boy somewhere south of the ridge with a piece of oilskin and instructions she'd given him before she understood what the North was going to give her in return. and an alpha at a manufactured western border dispute who didn't know his pack was about to be swallowed. She looked north, back toward the plateau, toward the dark ice that had looked at her and found something worth answering. Then she looked south. The choice was not between going back and not going back. She'd understood that since the moment Bryn fell through the door of the stone structure. The choice was between going back as Lara Vale, former Luna, exiled, stripped, walking through a gate someone else controlled, and going back as what she was now. What she was now did not yet have a name. She was going to need one before she crossed that border again. But names came after the action that earned them, not before. She pulled the bolt out of her ice sheet without touching the tip. Let it drop, looked at the dark-haired fighter who'd shouted, who was still holding Aldrich by the collar while two others had Goran's horse by the bridle. "What's your name?" she said. He looked at her hands, at the ice sheet. "Cass," he said. "Caspian Row." "How long have you been with the Ashenvale enforcers?" 4 years. "Do you know the western route to the Crestfall border?" He blinked. "Yes." "Can you move this column fast enough to reach Alpha Vale before the low fall does?" A pause. He was doing math. She could see it. "Depends on when the low fall moves," he said. 3 days. Maybe less. She looked at the column, at the faces of 200 people who were waiting to understand what was happening. 3 days to ride west, reach your Alpha, bring him back with whatever Crestfall forces he can negotiate in that window, and put a defended position between Ashenvale and what's coming. And you? She looked south, toward the ridge, toward the border, toward Ashenvale. "I'll meet you there," she said. Caspian Row looked at the ice sheet she'd made out of air and the black-tipped bolt on the ground, and then he looked at her face, and she saw the moment he made his own calculation. Not about her power, not about what she'd done to the temperature in this bowl, but about the simpler and more immediate question of whether the person speaking to him knew what they were doing. He turned to the column. "Formation southwest," he said, the voice of a man who'd been waiting 4 years for an order that made sense. "Full march pace, we move in 3 minutes." She turned north, back toward the ridge, back toward whatever Bryn and Sable had managed in the eastern drainage, back toward the border she was going to cross again, on her own terms this time, in the dark, in the cold, carrying something in her chest that 2 weeks ago she hadn't known existed. The wind picked up around her. Her wind. And somewhere behind her, in the ice sheet she'd left standing in the bowl, the black-tipped bolt sat in the frozen air like a sentence that had been started and not finished, waiting for the rest of its meaning to arrive. Because the hand that had launched it was now bound, and the plan it had been part of was now in pieces, and the woman it had been aimed at was walking north through the frozen north as if the cold were something she owned, which it was, which it had always been, she was beginning to understand, even before the dark ice, even before exile, even before Darren's flat eyes and Grand's pre-concluded smile and 50 people watching her walk through a gate without a word in her defense. Some things don't get made by what happens to you. Some things are just revealed by it. She crossed the ridge into the dark. She crossed the border at night. Not through the gate. She hadn't approached the gate. She'd come south along the eastern drainage the way Sable had described it. 6 hours of broken terrain in the dark, following frozen creek beds and rock exposures by feel more than sight, with the cold moving ahead of her like a scout, pressing outward from her radius in a way that she was beginning to understand was not just temperature, but information. The cold told her things. Where the ground was stable, where something warm was moving, animal or human, where the air pressure changed because terrain was about to change. She crossed the border through a section of the tree line where the old boundary markers had rotted to stumps and the enforcers had stopped walking patrol 3 winters ago because the northern edge was considered secure by virtue of being the northern edge. Nobody survived the frozen north, except her. She moved south through Ashenvale's forest with her knife in her hand and the cold tight against her skin, and she ran the numbers one more time in the dark because the numbers were all she had until she could see the situation with her own eyes. Caspian Row's column riding west toward the Crestfall border. She had to trust that. The eastern drainage route meant she'd lost track of Sable and Bryn, but they'd had a 3-hour head start, and Sable knew this terrain the way Lyra knew the inside of the healing house. She had to trust that too. What she couldn't trust was the timeline. 3 days had been Bryn's estimate, 8 days since he'd left Ashenvale, which put his information at 8 days old, before she'd even heard it. The Lowfall could be moving now. The Lowfall could have moved yesterday. She ran. She smelled smoke before she saw light. The wrong kind of smoke. Not hearth fire, not cooking fire. The dense, choking smoke of structures burning, of materials that weren't meant to burn forced into burning by something applied from outside. She came out of the tree line onto the southern ridge that overlooked Ashenvale's main settlement, and she stopped, and she looked at what was below her, and the cold around her went absolutely rigid. The eastern quarter was burning, not the whole settlement, not yet. But the eastern quarter, which held the grain stores and the lower-tier housing and the old market structure, was lit up against the dark sky in a way that meant the fire had been going long enough to be past containment by ordinary means. The settlement's warning bells were sounding, 3 of them in overlapping rhythm, which was the code for external attack rather than internal fire. The Lowfall had moved early. She ran down the ridge. She'd been a Luna for 6 years. She knew this settlement the way you know a body you've tended. Every weakness, every point of stress, every place where the structure was sound, and every place where it was held together by habit and optimism. She knew the defensive positions, and she knew which ones were actually defensible and which ones were traditional rather than tactical. She knew the water system, and she knew the enforcement posts, and she knew, running down that ridge in the dark with the fire painting the sky ahead of her, exactly where the worst of it would be. The main gate was already compromised. She could see it from 200 yards out. The gate itself was intact, but the approach to it was a tangle of fighting, Ashenvale defenders, and Lowfall fighters in the specific brutal close-range chaos of a position that had been partially breached and was being contested inch by inch. The Lowfall numbers were larger. Not overwhelming, not yet, but larger. And the Ashenvale defenders were fighting without a command structure she could identify from the outside, which meant either the command structure had been hit early or it had never fully assembled in the first place. Goran's work. Even absent, running west somewhere with Aldrich, he'd done his work. The patrol schedules he'd passed to the Lowfall had contained timing information, position information, the specific vulnerabilities that an insider would know and a field commander would use to strip the head off a defensive response in the first 10 minutes. She didn't go to the main gate, she went around it. The north wall of the settlement had a maintenance passage. Not a gate, not a door, a passage built for moving equipment during the wall's original construction and never properly sealed because it was narrow enough that no one had considered it a significant security gap. She'd flagged it in a council report 2 years ago. The report had been acknowledged and filed. She went through the passage at a crouch and came up inside the wall with fire on her left and fighting on her right, and the cold pressing out from her in every direction like something that wanted to be useful. She let it be. The temperature in her immediate radius had been running about 15 degrees below ambient since she'd come off the ridge. She felt it as a kind of pressure now, the contained version, the held breath version. She released the hold. The cold expanded outward in a 30-foot wave, and the Lowfall fighters on the south side of the main gate breach stumbled. Not fell, not incapacitated, but the sudden temperature drop was the kind of physical shock that interrupted muscle function for 2 to 3 seconds, long enough for the Ashenvale defenders on that side to close a gap that had been widening. A defender turned and saw her. Young woman, maybe 20, with blood on her face from a cut at her hairline and the wide pupils of someone operating on adrenaline well past the comfortable threshold. She stared at Lyra for 1 full second. "Luna," she said. "Where's your senior enforcer?" Lyra said. "Hendricks is—" "He's at the east wall. They hit the east wall first. We think it was a diversion." "It was. Stay on this breach. Don't let them widen it." She was already moving. "If you see the temperature drop, step back 3 feet and hold your position. Don't fight into the cold." The young woman didn't ask questions. She turned back to the breach. Lyra moved east. The east wall was worse. The grain store fire was providing light that turned the east wall's fighting ground into a nightmare of shadow and orange, shapes that could be attacker or defender until you were close enough that it didn't matter. The low fall had pushed through a section of the east wall, not a breach, an actual section of wall that had come down, and she understood immediately what had happened. Not a ram, not a standard breach technique. Something had been placed against the wall's foundation from the outside, some prepared structural assault that required knowing exactly where the wall was weakest. Patrol schedule information, position information. The slow, patient work of a traitor who'd had 2 years to prepare a gift for his allies. She found Hendricks by his voice, a big man with the carrying authority of someone who'd been giving commands in bad situations long enough that the voice had developed its own armor. He was coordinating a defense line 30 feet back from the collapsed section, working with what he had, which was not enough. Hendricks. He turned. His face did something complicated and then locked back into command mode. Luna, I'm here. Talk to me. How many low fall came through that section? 40? Maybe 50. We've contained them to this district, but the fire, I know, the fire's a clock. She looked at the collapsed section. Through it, the dark outside, the low fall forces massing for a second push. How long until they come through again? Minutes? 10? Less? Pull your people back 20 feet from the line you've got. He stared at her. 20 feet, she said. I need space between your fighters and that opening. If we pull back, 20 feet, Hendricks, then hold. Don't advance until I say. He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds. The 2 seconds of a man measuring a risk he doesn't fully understand against the authority of the person presenting it, and then he started issuing orders. She turned to face the collapsed wall section. She hadn't done this before. She needed to be honest with herself about that, because the moment she wasn't honest with herself about the limits of what she was doing was the moment she started making errors that would cost lives. She'd dropped temperatures. She'd crystallized air moisture into a projectile barrier. She'd felt the cold respond to her intent in the way water responds to a channel. It went where the channel told it to go, but the channel had to be correctly shaped. She shaped the channel. It wasn't a thought. It was closer to a posture. A way of holding the new thing in her chest, the old ice thing, the deep shelf thing, oriented outward and downward toward the ground in front of the collapsed section, toward the water in the soil, toward the moisture in the air over that 20-foot space she'd cleared. She exhaled. The ground in front of the collapsed wall section frosted over in 4 seconds. Not a light frost. A hard, deep penetrating freeze that turned the churned mud and blood of the fighting ground into a surface with the grip and stability of a skating surface. Simultaneously, the air above it dropped, and the moisture in that air crystallized, and what formed in the 20 feet of space between Ashenvale's pulled-back defenders and the collapsed wall section was not a wall, not a barrier, but a field of standing ice formations, irregular, chest-high, dense enough that moving through them fast was impossible. The low-fall fighters who came through the collapsed section in the next 60 seconds hit that field and slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. But in a defensive engagement, slowed was enough. The Ashenvale defenders didn't need the opening wide. They needed the opening narrow. And the ice field had narrowed it to single-file movement in 4 lanes, which meant Hendricks's people could address each lane instead of a front, a math problem that Ashenvale could actually solve. She heard Hendrick's voice behind her, reorganizing, redirecting, the sound of a competent man who'd just been handed a tool he hadn't expected and was using it immediately. She moved. She was in the settlement center when she heard his voice. Not Goran, not Aldrich. Darren. Darren Vale, Alpha of Ashenvale, who was supposed to be 3 days west at a manufactured border dispute, was in the settlement center square with 6 enforcers around him and dried road dust on his coat, and a look on his face that Lyra had never seen there in 6 years of watching his expressions. He'd come back. She stopped at the edge of the square and looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them moved for a moment that had the specific weight of everything unsaid in the history between them pressing down on it simultaneously. He looked diminished. That was the word her mind found, and she didn't fight it because she was done softening things to make them easier to process. Not physically smaller. Diminished in the way of a person who has spent the last several days discovering that the ground they were standing on was not what they'd believed it to be. His jaw was set and his eyes were clear, but there was something behind the clarity that was new. Not the flatness she'd last seen in this face, not the careful managerial distance of a man who'd decided his relationship to her was administrative. Something that looked, if she was reading it without mercy, like a man who had spent 3 days finding out what he'd done. "You came back," he said. "I live here," she said. And then, because she didn't have time for anything that wasn't operational, "Did Caspian Row reach you?" "He reached me 4 hours ago. I had a Crestfall escort already, a dispute negotiation contingent. I brought them with me. They're at the main gate." He was moving toward her. "Lyra, how many Crestfall fighters?" 30, plus your column. 90 of mine. I had to leave." He stopped, looked at her hands, at the frost that moved around her. His face changed again. "What happened to you?" "North happened to me." She held his gaze. "We have low-fall forces through the east wall and a main gate breach in progress and the eastern quarter on fire. I've got the east wall slowed. The main gate needs your Crestfall fighters on the outside approach to cut off their reinforcement line and your people plugging the breach from the inside. The fire needs water teams now before it jumps to the central quarter." He was looking at her with the expression of a man recalibrating every coordinate he'd been using to navigate. "Darren," she said it flat and direct, "I need you to be your alpha right now. We can do everything else after." Something in his jaw tightened. He nodded once, turned to his enforcers, and started issuing commands with the clipped authority of a man who knew his territory and knew his people and was putting both to work. She turned back to the east wall. Guadk. The next 2 hours were the most brutal of her life, and she had a reference set that now included 12 days alone in the frozen north. She moved through the fighting ground like a system rather than a person, not because she was detached, but because detachment was the only version of herself that was useful to the people around her in those 2 hours. She was cold in calculation and the specific resource of something that the low-fall fighters had never planned for, because no plan for taking Ashenvale had included the possibility that the woman they'd been told was dead in the north would come back through the east wall with winter in her hands. She didn't fight with the cold the way a weapon fighter uses a weapon. She used it the way a healer uses anatomy, with precision, targeted at the specific points where a small intervention produced a large change in outcome. A frozen patch of ground in front of a position that was about to be overrun. A temperature drop that broke a concentrated low-fall advance at the moment of its maximum pressure. Ice formations in doorways and passage points that turned 3 wide, low-fall movement into 1 wide. And 1 wide was something Ashenvale's defenders could handle. She took a blade across her left forearm from a low-fall fighter who came through a doorway she hadn't frozen in time. The cut was shallow, and she didn't stop moving. She took a thrown axe handle against her right shoulder that numbed her arm to the elbow for 20 minutes. She kept moving. The cold was not affected by the shoulder. It didn't live in her arm, she was learning. It lived somewhere deeper, somewhere the anatomy of it hadn't been established yet. She could freeze the air with her teeth clenched against the shoulder pain, and that was useful information. Around the 90-minute mark, the Low-Fall's forward commanders understood that the east wall push was not going to close. She felt the change in their movement before she identified the source of it. The specific shift in a military operations momentum when the people running it have done the math and found the math isn't working. They pulled back from the east wall, not retreat. Strategic repositioning. They were going to consolidate at the main gate breach, she realized. Throw everything at the main gate breach where Ashenvale's defense had been thinner from the start, overwhelm it before the Crestfall fighters on the outside approach could cut the reinforcement line, and push into the settlement's center before the east wall defenders could redeploy. She ran. The main gate was a different world from the east wall. Louder, more chaotic, the compressed violence of a breach that had been contested for 2 hours and where both sides were running on the fumes of adrenaline with the steadier fuel burned off. She came through the settlement side of the gate approach and she saw the line. Ashenvale defenders stretched thinner than they should have been, holding, but barely, and on the far side of the breach, the low-fall massing with the specific dense geometry of a force preparing a final push. Darren was there, at the line, not behind it. At it, sword in hand, blood on his coat. From the color and placement, she read it as his own blood, left side, a cut or graze he'd taken and hadn't stopped for, fighting at his own gate breach with the absolute unambiguous commitment of a man who had no moves left except this one. She stopped when she saw it. She hadn't expected to feel anything. She'd been so deliberate about the emotional accounting, the grief burned down, the love assessed and found to have been real and also insufficient, the mate bond gone, the 6 years tallied with clear eyes. She'd believed she'd completed that accounting. She felt something watching him fight. Not the old love, not the hollow of the severed bond. Something else. Something that looked at a man standing at his own gate with blood on his coat and nothing in his hands except a sword and the willingness to use it, and felt the complicated, involuntary recognition of one person for another person's specific quality of stubbornness. She moved past it, through it, into position. The low-fall push came 60 seconds later. She let it come 8 feet into the breach before she met it. The cold that came out of her in that moment was not the controlled, precise, targeted cold of the last 2 hours. It was what lived under that. The raw version, the plateau version, the thing the dark ice had pressed into her chest without asking her size first. It came out of her like an exhaled breath that didn't stop, and the air in the breach went from winter cold to something that had no name in ordinary temperature language. And the low-fall fighters in the front of the push stopped the way people stop when a force they cannot quantify presses against them from a direction they didn't know forces could come from. Ice formed on their armor. Ice formed on the ground beneath their feet, beneath her feet, beneath everyone's feet. And she felt Ashenvale's defenders stumble behind her, and she heard Darren's voice, "Hold, hold, step back, let her—" And they held. They stepped back. They gave her the breach. She stood in the breach. The low-fall force on the other side of it looked at her. She looked back. The frost around her had built into a visible radius. She could see it, the hanging crystals in the air around her body. The temperature distortion that made the space she occupied look slightly wrong to the eye, the way heat shimmer works, but colder. Her breath was a sustained white cloud that didn't disperse. The dark-edged fingernails. The old ice thing in her chest, wide open now, not contained, not directed, simply present in a way that anyone within 20 feet of her could feel as a physical pressure. The low-fall front line did not advance. 1 second, 2, 5. Then from somewhere in the mass of the low-fall force, a voice, a commander's voice, the kind trained to carry over field noise, shouted something in the low-fall dialect. She didn't know the language, but she'd heard that tone in enough situations to know it as a withdrawal order. The front line pulled back 2 steps, then 5. Then the mass of the force was moving, and it was not the movement of a tactical repositioning. It was the movement of people who have encountered a variable that was not in their intelligence and have made the field decision that the mission parameters as understood no longer apply. The low fall was pulling back from the main gate. She stood in the breach and watched them go and did not follow. Behind her, Ashenvale's defenders were making sounds, Tissot, not words yet, just the released breath sounds of people who have been holding a physical and psychological extreme for 2 hours and have been handed a moment that might possibly be, the moment when the holding is enough. She turned around. Darren was 10 feet behind her. Blood on his coat, dark at the left side, more than a graze. She read it as a cut that needed attention and hadn't gotten it. Sword still in his hand, eyes on her face. The thing she'd felt watching him fight was still in her chest, sitting beside the old ice thing, occupying entirely different space. "Lyra," he said. His voice had the quality of someone who has been composing a sentence for 3 days and is now discovering that none of the composed versions are right. "I know," she said. I know you didn't engineer it. I know Goran managed you. I know about Aldrich." She held his gaze. "I know you didn't know." Something in his face broke along a line that had been under pressure for longer than either of them had understood. "I should have," he said. "Yes." She didn't soften it. "You should have." The breach behind her was empty. The fire in the eastern quarter was lower. Water teams had reached it. She could hear the change in the smoke. From outside the main gate, she could hear Crestfall fighters and Ashenvale's mobile column engaging the retreating low-fall rear. Not pursuit, containment, the distinction she'd have drawn herself. Caspian Row had gotten them there in time. She turned to look at the breach, at the gate, at the dark outside where the low-fall force was retreating. Then she turned back to Darren. "The low-fall commander is still out there," she said. "He pulled back from the breach because of what he saw. That's not surrender. That's recalculation. He's going to spend the next 4 hours deciding whether what he saw is a weapon Ashenvale has or whether it's a specific individual who can be removed from the equation." Darren processed that. "What do we do?" "You hold the gate with everything you have. You get your wounded stable and your water teams on the fire. You get a message to the Crestfall escort about what just happened at the breach." She picked up a sword from the ground, one of the discarded low-fall blades, heavier than she usually used, but functional. "And you send someone to find where the low-fall commander has positioned himself. And then," she looked at him, at his blood-dark coat, at the face she'd spent 6 years reading and had apparently been reading the wrong translation of. "And then I go find him before he finishes recalculating," she said. "Because the only way to end this tonight, not delay it, not reposition it, end it, is to make the decision-maker understand that the variable he encountered at the breach is not a weapon that can be seized or a position that can be flanked." "It's you," Darren said. Not a question. "It's me." She looked at the gate. "And I'm not a position that can be flanked." Outside, somewhere in the dark beyond Ashenvale's walls, the low-fall commander was doing his math. The fire in the east had dropped to a manageable roar. The breach behind her was clear. The settlement around her was battered and breathing, the specific breathing of something that has taken a blow and is deciding whether it is still standing. It was still standing. She was going to make sure it stayed that way. Not for the pack that had exiled her. Not for the gate she'd walked through and bound wrists. Not for the crowd that had watched her go without a word. But because she had decided, in the frozen north, in the hollow of the stone structure, in the basin's perfect quiet, in the center of the dark ice, that what she built would be built on her own terms. And her own terms started here. She checked the blade in her hand, checked the cold in her chest, steady, vast, patient, present. Looked at Darren one more time. "Stay at the gate," she said. "Don't follow me." He looked at her with the eyes of a man who understood that the person in front of him was no longer the person he'd sent into the north, and that the person she was now did not require his protection, and that the correct response to both of those facts was to stand exactly where she'd told him to stand. "Come back," he said. She walked through the gate. The dark outside was full of sounds, retreating forces, the Crestfall containment, fire in the distance, wind, and underneath all of it, barely audible, the specific silence of a commander who has stopped moving and started thinking. She found the low-fall commander's position by the cold. Not by sight, not by sound. By the temperature map her radius was building, the subtle warmth differential of 40 people clustered in a position 300 yards northeast of the gate, in the sheltered depression of the old orchard ground, where the trees were thick enough to hold a command group out of sight lines. She moved toward it through the dark. The cold moved with her. And the low-fall commander, whoever he was, whatever he'd decided in his 4 hours of recalculation, was about to find that the variable he'd encountered at the breach had followed him out of the walls and had brought the entire north behind her. She found him standing at the edge of the orchard, not hiding, not crouched behind his command cluster with maps and calculations. Standing at the edge, facing back toward Ashenvale's gate, watching the distant firelight the way a man watches something he's decided he doesn't understand yet and isn't ready to pretend he does. The low-fall commander was perhaps 45, built for cold weather and long campaigns, broad through the chest, economical in the way of someone who'd learned decades ago that wasted movement was wasted life. He wore no special insignia, but she'd identified him by the way the 40 people around him oriented, not toward the loudest voice, toward the stillest one. Commanders who shouted were common. Commanders who stood still and let the situation come to them were rare and generally more dangerous. She walked out of the dark and into the edge of his firelight. His hand went to his sword, stopped there, did not draw. The 40 people around him did draw. Steel, a half circle of it, aimed at a woman who walked alone out of the dark of the old orchard with frost hanging in the air around her, and her eyes carrying the particular quality of someone who has already determined the outcome of the next 60 seconds and is simply waiting for the other parties to arrive at the same conclusion. "I'm going to tell you 3 things," Lyra said. She stopped 10 feet from him. "Then you tell me one." He held her gaze. His sword hand stayed on the hilt. "The people who told you Ashenvale was compromised from the inside were right," she said. "Goran and Aldrich had been working your commanders for 2 years. The patrol schedule information was real, the defensive position information was real, and the intelligence about timing was real." She let that land. "What wasn't real was the part where Ashenvale collapses because an insider told you it would. Goran is in the north with a column that is no longer under his command. Aldrich is in custody. The inside of your operation is gone." The commander's jaw moved. Not words, just the small involuntary adjustment of a man receiving information his body processed slightly before his command face caught up. "Second thing, I was in the frozen north for 12 days. I came back through your formation because your formation couldn't stop me. What you saw at the main gate breach tonight is not a weapon Ashenvale controls. It is not a position you can flank, a resource you can capture, or a variable you can plan around." She held her left hand out, palm up, and the frost in the air above it crystallized slowly into a flat disk of dark ice the size of her palm, dark blue, solid, which she held for 4 seconds and then let fall and shatter on the ground between them. "You cannot take Ashenvale while I am in it. That is a fact, not a threat. Threats require uncertainty." The half-circle of drawn steel had not lowered. The commander was looking at the shattered dark ice on the ground. "Third thing," she said, "you didn't start this war. You were offered an opportunity that looked clean and wasn't, and you took it because that's what commanders do when the intelligence seems solid. The intelligence was manufactured by people whose goals were not your goals. You've lost 40 fighters tonight. Ashenvale has lost fewer. The position has not improved since you arrived, and it is not going to improve." She met his eyes. "So here's the one thing I need you to tell me. What does the Lowfall actually want from this territory? Not what Goran offered you. Not the patrol corridors and the supply route or some access. What does the Lowfall actually need?" Silence. One of his fighters shifted. He made a small motion with his right hand and they stilled. He looked at her for a long time. "Water rights," he said. "The eastern tributary. Lowfall's southern settlements have had drought conditions for 3 seasons. The tributary that runs through Ashenvale's eastern boundary feeds directly into our groundwater system, and your pack's upstream damming has been cutting our flow by 60%. She held very still inside. Something that was not cold but felt adjacent to it moved through her. The specific sensation of a thing clicking into place. The way a bone relocates after dislocation. The brief bright pain of something returning to where it was supposed to sit. The eastern tributary. She'd written a report 18 months ago about the upstream damming, not about Lowfall water rights, about Ashenvale's own agricultural water management. The dam had been built by the previous Alpha's administration, and it was overbuilt, poorly designed, retaining more than it needed to because the engineer who designed it had been conservative to the point of damage. She'd flagged it. The report had been filed. 2 years of a trader feeding intelligence to a neighboring pack. 2 years of patrol schedules and position information and carefully manufactured tension. And underneath all of it, underneath the treachery and the framing and the exile and the blood, there had been something as plain and unglamorous as a badly designed dam. People made catastrophic choices when their children were thirsty. She'd known that as a healer. She'd apparently not carried it far enough. "If the dam is adjusted," she said carefully, "and the eastern tributary flow is restored to pre-damming levels, does the Lowfall have any other claim on Ashenvale's territory?" He looked at her. "No." "Does the Lowfall have any interest in a formal water rights agreement, documented, enforceable, with a joint oversight structure to prevent future damming without bilateral consent?" A pause. Longer. "That would depend," he said, "on whether Ashenvale's Alpha would honor such an agreement. The last 2 administrations have not shown a particular commitment to honoring agreements with Lowfall." "The last 2 administrations," she said, "did not have me." He held her gaze. She held his. "I'm not the Alpha of Ashenvale," she said. I want to be clear about that. What I am is the person who walked out of that gate tonight to find you, and what I'm offering is this, a cessation tonight, a withdrawal of low-fall forces to the pre-campaign boundary, and a formal negotiation to begin in 5 days with Ashenvale's Alpha and Council and a low-fall delegation. She paused. In exchange for which I will personally guarantee the dam adjustment begins within 48 hours and the eastern tributary flow is restored within 2 weeks. You'll personally guarantee it? Yes. You don't hold any official authority in Ashenvale. She looked at him steadily. I held the main gate breach with my hands. I walked through your formation in the dark, and you didn't know until I was standing in your firelight. I'm offering you an agreement instead of continuing the conversation we were having at the gate. She let that sit. I think we both understand what kind of authority I'm currently operating with. He was quiet. Around them, his fighters were still, drawn steel and cold breath in the orchard dark pressing in. The distant sounds of Ashenvale. Bells quieter now, fire lower, the specific settling sound of a crisis moving from acute to aftermath. The commander looked at the shattered dark ice on the ground between them. 5 days, he said. 5 days. Low-fall delegation of 6, neutral documentation. Agreed. He looked at her one more time with the expression of a man who is recalibrating something at a fundamental level and who is honest enough with himself to do it in front of witnesses. What do I call you? He said. She thought about that. Lyra, she said. For now, at that. She was back inside the gate before the sky began to lighten. The east wall was stable. The low fall had pulled back fully. The ice formations she'd built had been left intact, and the defenders had used them as part of a reorganized line that Hendricks had the presence of mind to consolidate before anyone told him to. The fire in the eastern quarter was out, or close enough that the remaining heat was a glow rather than a threat. The wounded were being moved to the healing house. She went to the healing house first, not to be treated, to work. The healer on duty was a woman named Petra, who'd been Ashenvale's second healer for 11 years, and who looked at Lyra when she came through the door with the focused assessment of someone deciding whether the new arrival was a resource or a problem. Your arm, Petra said. I know. I'll handle it after I've looked at the serious ones. Petra looked at her for 1 second, then, 12 wounded, 4 critical. 2 of the critical are yours to look at first. Lyra washed her hands in the basin at the door, the automatic gesture of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, the water cold against the cut on her forearm, stinging clean, and went to the first critical patient. She worked for 2 hours. It was the most clarifying 2 hours of the night, which was saying something given what the night had contained. The work of the healing house was the work she'd been doing since before she was Luna, since before Darren, since before Ashenvale had any particular claim on her. It was the work she'd done in the stone structure in the north with Bryn's blade wound and a jar of rendered fat, and before that in this same room with its same smell of dried herbs and wound wash, and it was the work that asked of her exactly what it had always asked: attention, knowledge, care, and the willingness to stay present with a person who was hurt. She stayed present. When the 2 critical patients were stable, and the other 10 had been assessed and treated, and the ones who could sleep were sleeping, she sat down on the floor in the corner of the healing house with her back to the wall and looked at the cut on her forearm and felt the full weight of the night pressing down. She didn't fight it. This was the other thing she'd learned in the north, that not the cold, not the power in the dark ice, but the simpler and less dramatic thing learned in the stone structure in the dark with her knife in her hand and her eyes open. That endurance was not the same as suppression, that letting a thing move through you was not the same as being destroyed by it, that the hollow in her chest and the ragged mate bond scar and the grief and the anger and the specific complicated things she'd felt watching Darren fight at the gate. All of it could exist simultaneously, and none of it canceled any other thing out. You didn't have to resolve it to survive it. You just had to let it all be there at the same time. She was sitting there when Bryn appeared in the healing house doorway. He looked terrible and intact. The wound on his side had been redressed. She could see the fresh binding, and Sable had apparently gotten him back through the eastern drainage because he was alive and standing and looking at her with the specific relief of someone who'd been told you were at the healing house and had walked there faster than a person with a fresh side wound should be walking. She looked at him. He crossed the floor and sat down on the ground beside her. back against the same wall, and didn't say anything for a moment. "Sable," she said. "Safe. She and Vaughn are outside. They wouldn't come in. Vaughn said he doesn't do walls." He paused. "She said to tell you the drainage route is open and that she'll be back in the north by morning." "She didn't want to see me." "She said she already saw what she needed to see. She said some things don't need a closing scene." Lyra looked at the healing house ceiling. "The oilskin," she said. "Hendrix has it. I gave it to him 3 hours ago when I came through the gate. He was—" Bryn paused. "He was very focused on it." "Good," she breathed. "Good." They sat in the quiet of the healing house, the two of them, with the smell of wound wash and dried herbs, and the specific smell of a room that had been worked hard through the night, and outside the window the sky was moving from black to the deep gray blue that preceded dawn. "You could have died," Bryn said. "Multiple times," she agreed. "That's not—" "I wasn't asking for confirmation." "I know." She looked at him. "I could have died. You could have died. 8 days, alone, with a blade wound, through the north. Don't minimize what you did by calling it less than what it was." His jaw was working. 16 years old, and he'd made a decision that most adults wouldn't have made, and he'd carried it through the north and through a battle. And he was sitting here doing what people did when the thing they'd been running toward had arrived, and they discovered that arrival felt different than anticipated. Not less, just different, more complicated, less clean. "What happens now?" he said. "You sleep. Then you go back to your mother and tell her you're alive before she loses her mind completely." She paused. "After that, it's up to you." "And you?" She thought about that. The low-fall agreement, 5 days, the dam adjustment, a formal negotiation with Ashenvale's Alpha and Council, which meant a conversation with Darren that was going to be the hardest conversation either of them had ever had. Not because of anger, but because honesty was harder to sit with than anger, and what they owed each other was honesty at a level that would require them both to see clearly in the dark. The pack that had watched her walk through the gate. 50 faces that she was going to have to look at in the daylight and decide for each one not what they deserved, but what she was going to do with the fact of them. Because she was going to stay in Ashenvale. That was the decision she'd made somewhere in the orchard dark, somewhere between the low-fall commander's flat question and his 3-word answer about water rights. She was going to stay, but not in the form she'd been. You couldn't go back to being the shape a container had forced you into once you'd found out what your actual shape was. She was going to stay as what she was, whatever name that eventually earned. Bum. Darren found her outside as the sky finished its turn from gray-blue to the flat white of a winter dawn. She heard him coming. She heard most things now with a sensitivity that was probably the cold's contribution to her senses, or possibly just the heightened attunement of a body that had spent 2 weeks being very serious about not dying. She heard his footsteps, and she heard the particular quality of them. Deliberate, measured. The footsteps of a man who'd decided what he was going to say and was walking toward the saying of it. She was standing at the east wall, looking at the ice formations she'd built in the breach overnight. They were still standing in the early morning cold, which made sense. She'd built them, and the cold had held, and the temperature hadn't risen yet. They looked strange in the daylight, organic and angular at the same time, like something that had grown rather than been constructed. The light moved through the outer surfaces with the specific blue refraction of ice that was not ordinary ice. She'd made that. She was still getting used to that fact. Darren stopped beside her and looked at the formations. "I got a preliminary count," he said. "Ashenvale lost 9 fighters. The low fall lost 41. The eastern quarter damage is significant, but the structures are standing. The fire didn't reach the grain stores." "The grain stores were my first priority," she said. "If the fire had reached the stores, the winter math would have been very bad." "I know." He was quiet. "Hendrix told me about the breach, what you did. It's a long conversation." "I know that too." He turned to look at her profile, and she let him look. "Lyra." She looked at him. His face in the morning light had the stripped quality of someone who'd spent a night in combat and hadn't slept and was not going to sleep until certain things had been said that had been needing to be said for longer than either of them had been willing to admit. The blood on his coat had dried dark. The cut on his left side was his own. She could see it now, better than she'd been able to in the gate's firelight. A field dressing, competent, someone had looked at it. He looked like a man who'd had the particular experience of discovering that the ground he'd been standing on had been prepared for him by people he trusted, and that his own choices had let them do it. "I believed Goran," he said. "I know. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm telling you what I did. I believed him. I chose to believe him because believing him was easier than looking at what was in front of me, which was that my own second seat had spent years constructing a version of Ashenvale's reality that served his interests, and I had let him do it because I didn't want the work of seeing clearly." He held her gaze. "I chose blindness, Lyra. It had a cost. You paid most of it." The wind off the east wall moved between them. She thought about what it cost to say that. A man like Darren, built from birth into alpha structure, trained from childhood that the cost of leadership was certainty and the performance of certainty. The specific, grinding, genuine difficulty of standing in front of someone you'd wronged and refusing to dress it up as circumstance or misfortune. She'd had 12 days in the North to understand her own failures and sit with them without excuse. He'd had 3 days and a battle. He was here. He was saying it clearly. That wasn't nothing. "I know," she said, "and I need you to understand something." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to pretend the last 6 years were something other than what they were. I'm not going to tell you the exile made me stronger, so it was worth it. It wasn't worth it. I suffered genuinely, and I almost died, and I will carry specific things from that time that you cannot fix, and I am not asking you to try." His jaw tightened. "What I'm telling you," she said, "is that what needs to happen now is not about us. There is a low-fall delegation coming in 5 days and a water rights agreement to negotiate and a dam to adjust and a pact that is going to need to understand what just happened and why it happened. There is a council seat that needs to be restructured because Aldrich's absence leaves a gap that cannot be filled by anyone who is operating under the same blind spot you were. I want you at that council," he said. She looked at him. "Not as Luna," he said, "or not only as Luna. Ashenvale needs the kind of person who reads the tributary reports and sees the dam problem before it becomes a war. The kind of person who can look at a situation and tell me what I'm missing because I'm too close to it." He paused. "I need someone who is not going to manage my view of reality in exchange for my trust. That's a different relationship than what we had." "I know." His voice was quiet and specific. "I know what I'm asking for is different. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything. I'm asking anyway." She looked at the ice formations in the breach, at the blue light moving through them, at the specific texture of what she'd built under pressure, the structure that had held because it had been built from what was actually there rather than from what she'd wished was there. That was the thing about the North, she thought. It didn't tell you who to be. It stripped everything down to what was already true, and then it showed you what that truth was capable of, if you stopped hiding it inside what other people had decided your ceiling was. She'd spent 6 years building things that other people got to define. 6 years of competence filtered through structures that weren't hers. She wasn't going to do that again. "I'll be at the council," she said, "on my terms. Not as Luna as that role has been defined. As someone with my own authority and my own seat and my own vote, not an extension of the alpha seat." She looked at him. "If Ashenvale's structure can't accommodate that, then I will build the structure that can. That's not a threat. It's just what I'm willing to do and what I'm not." Darren held her gaze for a long time. "Yes," he said. "Not, we'll discuss it. Not, let's see what's possible. Yes." Simple and flat and carrying the weight of a man who'd spent the night understanding what it cost to say no to clear things and had decided he was done with that particular cost. She looked at him. The thing in her chest, the hollow of the severed mate bond, the old ice thing from the plateau, the complicated specific feeling of watching this man fight at his own gate, all of it was there simultaneously, and none of it resolved into a single clean emotion, which she was beginning to understand was not a failure of feeling, but simply the truth of a situation that had too much history to be simple. She didn't reach for him. He didn't reach for her. They stood at the east wall in the winter dawn with the ice formations between them and the settlement coming alive behind them, and that was enough for right now. Right now was enough. Bryn left 2 days later. She walked him to the south gate because she happened to be passing that way, which was only partially a lie. He was moving carefully around the side wound, but moving well. Petra had checked it that morning and pronounced it healing cleanly, which was the most optimistic Petra ever got in professional assessments, and therefore meant it was genuinely healing cleanly. At the gate he stopped and turned and looked at her the way 16-year-olds look at things they're trying to memorize because they understand they're in the presence of something they'll describe for the rest of their lives. "Will you be all right?" he said. She thought about the question seriously, because he'd asked it seriously. "I think so," she said. "The parts that are permanently changed, I'm learning to work with. The parts that still hurt, I'm leaving them there. You don't have to fix something to use it." He thought about that. That sounds like something someone says when they've gotten very comfortable with pain, or like something someone says when they've stopped being afraid of it. She looked at him. "There's a difference. You'll find it." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "She chose herself in the end." She raised an eyebrow. "That's what I'm going to tell people when they ask what happened. She chose herself, and it turned out that was the most powerful thing she'd ever done." He paused. "Is that right?" She looked at the south road, at the tree line, at the winter sky, pale and flat and enormous above the southern horizon. "Close enough," she said. He went south. She watched him go until the road bent and he was out of sight, and then she stood at the south gate for another minute in the cold that was her cold, that moved with her breathing, that had been in her all along and had simply needed the north to show her where to look. And she thought about Sabel's words in the basin. What would you become if you stopped letting other people write the answer? The answer was still being written. That was the truth of it. The Winter Queen, if that's what she became, if that was the name the world eventually found for what she was, would not be finished in a night or a week or a season. She was being written in real time by choices she was making and would make, by the dam adjustment and the low-fall negotiation and the council seat on her own terms, and the work in the healing house and the hard conversation with Darren that was ongoing and would probably be ongoing for a long time. That was fine. She was done with endings that other people decided for her. She turned back toward Ashenvale. The settlement in the morning light was damaged and standing and full of people doing the unglamorous work of the day after, repairing the east wall section, clearing the debris from the breach, assessing the eastern quarter structures, moving supplies to where supplies needed to be. Ordinary work. The work of people who'd survived a night and were now rebuilding the day. She walked back through the gate. The cold settled around her like something that belonged there. Because it did. It had always belonged there. She walked into the heart of Ashenvale's morning, into the work that was hers to do, into the life she was going to build on the ground the North had revealed to her. Not the life she'd been given, not the life she'd been assigned, not the life the pack had decided was the correct shape for the space she occupied. Hers. The girl they'd put on the ice was gone. What walked through that gate in the winter dawn was something the kingdom would spend years learning the name of, and by the time they'd found it, Winter Queen, they would call her, the one the North kept, the one the cold remembered. She would already be 3 decisions ahead of what they thought they understood. She always had been. They just hadn't been paying attention.